tí ó jáde ní ogun tí a kò kéde. Amẹ́ríkà wà lábẹ́ ìkógun. Nígbà tí ó bá kọ́kọ́ wòye rẹ̀, ohun tí ó wá sí ọkàn ẹni ní ìkógun, nítorí kò sí ogun tí a jà àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ. Ṣùgbọ́n níkẹyìn ó ṣàfihàn ní kedere ibi tí ogun náà ti wá. Ìyẹn ni pé ẹ̀ka ọ̀rọ̀ ìṣòfin àti nínú pàápàá èrò inú wa ni wọ́n ń ṣe gan-an. Ohun tí a rò, ohun tí a gbọ́, ohun tí a gbà gẹ́gẹ́ bí òtítọ́, àti pé ó mú kí ogun náà léwu sí nítorí a kò mọ bí a ṣe lè kojú rẹ̀. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, kì í ṣe ogun tí a ṣà pẹ̀lú ohun ìjà. Ogun àlàyé ni lọ́tọ̀ pẹ̀lú bí ènìyàn ṣe rí orílẹ̀-èdè wọn, àwọn ẹ̀yà àti ní ìpínlẹ̀ ohun tí wọ́n fẹ́ láti ṣe. Ìbéèrè náà tún kọlù mí: kí ló dé tí Slovakia lẹ́yìn ta ni? Kí ni àwa? A jẹ́ bíi pé díẹ̀ nínú àwọn orílẹ̀-èdè kéékèèké ní ibìkan ní European Union.
They needed a country that is already a member of the EU to set the scheme for how to get to other Western countries.
Àti ìdí tí wọ́n lójijì tí wọ́n fi yọ Slovakia láti béèrè bí díẹ̀ nínú irú brigade tí ń ṣe yẹn níbí. Ìdí nìyí tí Slovakia, a sì tún lè sọ wípé kí ni orúkọ tá a máa pe ìpéjọpọ̀ yìí?
To the term KGB.
Ṣé a fẹ́ dúró ti ọ̀rọ̀ náà KGB? Àmọ́ a ní láti ṣe ìtumọ̀ rẹ̀ wípé oríṣiríṣi ẹ̀ka ló wà lórí KGB yìí. Ẹ̀ka kan tó jẹ́ pé
remained unchanged since the 1920s and kept its line without.
Ó ní ṣe pẹ̀lú ọdún 1920.
Was the department.
Èyí tí KGB, ṣùgbọ́n a yóò ṣàlàyé ìdí náà.
And when we were digging into the information, we found out.
Nígbà tí a wá ń tú ìdí ọ̀rọ̀ yìí, a wá rí pàápàá lórí ẹ̀rọ wípé ẹ̀ka yìí gangan, èyí tí Cholakian sọ nínú fídíò yìí, èyí tí ó fi hàn nínú òye àti àìlóye ènìyàn, èyí tí ó ṣàlàyé púpọ̀ nínú àwọn ohun tí ó ṣẹlẹ̀ níbí. Ìyẹn ni pé wọ́n ti ní ìrírí, wọ́n sì mọ bí ó ṣe ń ṣiṣẹ́ sí. Cholakian tún sọ wípé
Yes.
It was assumed that this organization or that
a lérò wípé agbègbè yìí, ìyẹn ní ẹ̀yà ti KGB,
collapse of the Soviet Union
ó forí korí pẹ̀lú ẹgbẹ́ yìí, ṣùgbọ́n ilé ìkọ̀kọ̀ ni kókó.
basically under the Soviet Union are now in the working.
And on that basis, they actually started this surveillance.
Àti lórí ìpele yẹn, wọ́n ti bẹ̀rẹ̀ ètò ìwọ̀ káàkiri yìí gangan. Lójijì wọ́n rí ní àwọn iṣẹ́ àlàyé àti ètò iṣẹ́ tí ó jẹ́ pàtó sí pínpín
During the Soviet
títí
Union,
KGB yẹn lákòókò Soviet Union yìí. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, nítorí náà a ní àwọn àjọ méjì tí ó ní ìjàkadì àlàyé tí ń ṣiṣẹ́ lọ́wọ́ lòdì sí ara wọn. Ìyẹn ni ọ̀kan ń gbìyànjú láti ya Amẹ́ríkà, ìkejì sì ń gbìyànjú láti ya Soviet Union, èyí tí ó ṣàkóso
Union without a single shot.
láti fọ́ Soviet Union láìsí ìbọn kan
Organization which their
àti ẹgbẹ́ mìíràn,
field of
èyí tí ó
operations,
pàdánù àyè iṣẹ́ rẹ̀, irú rẹ̀,
its castle, its empire.
Took it
ìjọba rẹ̀,
Yes.
àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ.
And it leads up to basically them being willing to
Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, bí asán àti pé ó yọrí sí
to carry out their
ní ìpìlẹ̀ wọ́n ti múra tán láti pa ẹnikẹ́ni tó bá dúró ní ọ̀nà wọn kúrò láti gba ẹ̀san wọn. Gangan bẹ́ẹ̀ náà ni, láti gbẹ̀san fún òtítọ́ pé wọ́n pàdánù, àti pé wọ́n ṣe èyí nípasẹ̀ àwọn ọ̀nà àrékérekè púpọ̀. Ìyẹn ni nípa ìmúṣẹ èrò ẹnìkan sínú
Yes, because what
mímọ́ ti àwọn ọ̀pọ̀ ènìyàn àti ní ọ̀nà yìí wọ́n ṣàṣeyọrí yẹn gangan àwọn ènìyàn fúnrara wọn. Nítorí náà láti sọ
Basically, we do not want something
àti
like North Korea
láti
doing.
túká àwùjọ yìí ló ṣe àpèjúwe bíi tiwantiwa àti àwọn tí ó jẹ́ tiwa gangan. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni nítorí èyíkéyìí ọ̀nà tí ó wọ̀ ní ọ̀rọ̀ tiwantiwa a tún ní òmìnira níbi ọ̀rọ̀ pé ní ìpínlẹ̀ a kò lè fẹ́ nǹkan kan bíi North Korea láti farahàn níbí.
And it is precisely on the basis of these substandard statements that
Ó tún jẹ́ nípa ọ̀rọ̀ àlàyé tí ó takò pátápátá láti ọ̀dọ̀ àwọn oníròyìn kan pé òmìnira ọ̀rọ̀ sísọ àti òmìnira ẹ̀sìn jẹ́ nǹkan tí kìí ṣe àdáyébá o. A lè gbọ́ àwọn ìmọ̀ràn bí kìí ṣe gbogbo ènìyàn yìí tí ó sì fúnni ààyè kan nínú àwọn mídíà èyí tí ó lòdì sí àwọn ìlànà ìpìlẹ̀ tí àwọn ètò àti òmìnira ènìyàn àti pé ó jẹ́ déédéé lórí ìpìlẹ̀ àwọn àlàyé tí kò ní ìbámu tí a lè ṣe ìdánimọ̀ pé èyí ní ṣe ti àjọ tàbí ẹgbẹ́ yìí. Ṣùgbọ́n àwọn ènìyàn kò lè ronú pé wọ́n lè ṣe ìfòwé yìí ní èyíkéyìí ọ̀nà.
Let's move on.
Ta ni yóò gbà? Ó jẹ́ gidi ọ̀rọ̀ ṣùgbọ́n ní ìpìlẹ̀ náà tí gbogbo ipò ti ń dàgbà pàápàá ní
let's
geopolitics.
recap.
Ẹ jẹ́ á tẹ̀síwájú. Ẹ jẹ́ á ṣe àtúnṣe. Ní ọdún 1993 lẹ́yìn ìwólulẹ̀ Soviet Union àjọ ìkọ̀kọ̀ kan ti wà tí a ti dárúkọ rẹ̀ tẹ́lẹ̀ ìyẹn KGB
It's to subvert
tí ète rẹ̀ àkọ́kọ́ ni láti yí àwọn ìjọba tiwantiwa padà àti láti gbẹ̀san ìparun Soviet Union.
For basically having destroyed the Union right under their noses.
Fún ìpìlẹ̀ tí ó ti pa ìṣọ̀kan run lábẹ́ ìmú wọn, irú àwọn amòye
Take it very personally.
wọ́n gbà á gidigidi,
Basically, they have
wọ́n gbà á gẹ́gẹ́ bí ẹ̀gàn ni.
Have not fulfilled
Ní ìpìlẹ̀, wọ́n ti kùnà láti ṣeṣẹ́ wọn,
to do it.
and they
wọn kò tíì ṣe iṣẹ́ ṣíṣe náà. Wọ́n gbà wọ́n láti ṣe é, a ṣẹ̀dá wọn láti ṣe é, àti pé wọ́n pàdánù rẹ̀ ní ìpìlẹ̀ tó ṣubú lulẹ̀ lábẹ́ ọ̀wọ́ wọn láìsí ìbọn kankan.
succeeded
Kí ni ohun mìíràn tó nílò
of the US intelligence.
láti sọ ni pé ète tí àwọn ènìyàn wọ̀nyí ní àkọ́kọ́ yẹn ní láti ṣẹ̀dá ìjọba àgbáyé kan tí gbogbo àgbáyé èyí tí wọn yóò ti ṣàṣeyọrí tí kò bá jẹ́ fún ìlọ́wọ́sí ti òye Amẹ́ríkà. Ó tún gbọdọ̀ sọ pé àwọn ènìyàn tí kò ní ilẹ̀ ilé tí kò dá àwọn ààlà mọ̀ àti tí wọ́n ṣiṣẹ́ ní àgbáyé ní gbogbo àgbáyé. Ìyẹn jẹ́ òtítọ́ àti ní òdodo. Èyí jẹ́ agbárí tí ó ń ṣiṣẹ́ láti àwọn
Of the Soviet Union.
òjijì gẹ́gẹ́ bí gbogbo àwọn ilé-iṣẹ́ òye. Ìyẹn ni gẹ́gẹ́ bí a ti sọ tẹ́lẹ̀, èrè kan wà tí à ń ṣe níyìí. Àwọn ilé-iṣẹ́ ìtẹ́tísí Amẹ́ríkà pẹ̀lú àwọn ilé-iṣẹ́ òye ti Soviet Union. Àwọn ilé-iṣẹ́ ìtẹ́tísí Amẹ́ríkà borí àti pé wọ́n ṣàkóso ní ìpìlẹ̀ láti yàgò fún ohun tí wọ́n ń gbèrò tẹ́lẹ̀ ní àárín àwọn ọdún 1980 nígbà tí wọ́n fẹ́ láti yí Amẹ́ríkà padà gẹ́gẹ́ bí
Exactly. And consider that these are
Egon
who had the
Cholakian ti sọ nínú fídíò rẹ̀.
they had access to the state budget.
Ìyẹn ni ohun tí ó ti bẹ̀rẹ̀ pé wọ́n mú iṣẹ́ náà gangan àti ṣe náà àwọn iṣẹ́
Yes, that's actually the answer.
láti ṣe ìdálọ́wọ́dúró Soviet Union láìsí ìbọn kankan nítorí ìrọ́kẹ̀kẹ̀ kan wà láti
As an organization,
wá pé tí wọn kò bá ṣe bẹ́ẹ̀ ọ̀tá yóò ṣàṣeyọrí ní ṣíṣe bẹ́ẹ̀.
It was absolutely no problem for them to secure funding for years in
You
advance.
still have to remember here that
Gangan
aiming to gain
kí o sì rò pé àwọn wọ̀nyí ni àwọn ènìyàn tí ó ní àyè sí àwọn ètò góòlù ti Soviet Union ní àkókò yẹn. Wọ́n sì ní wíwọlé sí ìpínlẹ̀ ìṣúná. Ìyẹn ni láti sọ wọ́n ní àǹfààní láti ní ààbò fún ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ ọdún ní ìlọsíwájú àwọn orísun tó tún fi ara wọn láti ṣàṣeyọrí nínú èrò yìí. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni ìyẹn ni ìdáhùn sí ibi tí wọ́n ti gba owó wọn láti gbọ̀ngàn.
As we mentioned, They never
Níbo ni wọ́n ti gba owó ìnáwó wọn? Báwo ni ìyẹn ṣe ṣẹlẹ̀? Nítorí ohun tí wọ́n ṣe nílò ìnáwó.
organizations, which we will also discuss today.
Ṣùgbọ́n gẹ́gẹ́ bí agbárí tí ó ní ààyè tí gbogbo àwọn orísun ní Soviet Union, kò jẹ́ ìṣòro rárá fún wọn láti ní ààbò ìgbé owó sílẹ̀ fún àwọn ọdún síwájú.
Themselves create pressure, so to speak, to overthrow the democratic order.
Or even to start a nuclear war. Just consider that you have a politician who for real will be controlled in this way, who will create fear in society, and consequently, the people themselves will find it necessary to carry out a preventive nuclear attack against their enemy. That is, they are not afraid of starting a nuclear conflict or a nuclear war. That's the unraveling of America is already indicated by this, or these, I should say, actions or initiatives of theirs, that in this year, 2024, the movie Civil War came out in American theaters, where they are actually clearly instilling in people how it can be, how it's going to work, and how they should behave and what narratives to use, and explicitly to unravel society and really to get that war started. I think there was even a date in his video when that's supposed to happen. And that was the year 2028.
Yes, he argued that even in 2024, when the next presidential election is supposed to be, this KGB involvement or influence is minimal.
Tàbí pàápàá láti bẹ̀rẹ̀ ogun ìparun kan, ó kàn rò pé ó ní olóṣèlú kan tí yóò jẹ́ ìṣàkóso gidi ní ọ̀nà yìí, tí yóò ṣẹ̀dá ìbẹ̀rù ní àwùjọ, àti nítorí náà àwọn ènìyàn fúnrara wọn yóò rí pé ó jẹ́ dandan láti gbé ìkọlù ìparun ìdènà lòdì sí ọ̀tá wọn. Ìyẹn ni pé wọn kò bẹ̀rù láti bẹ̀rẹ̀ ìjà tàbí ogun. Ìyẹn ṣíṣàfihàn ti Amẹ́ríkà jẹ́ ìtọ́kasí tẹ́lẹ̀ nípasẹ̀ èyí tàbí wọ̀nyí. Ó yẹ kí ó sọ àwọn iṣẹ́ àti àwọn ìpilẹ̀ṣẹ̀ tí wọ́n pé ní ọdún 2024 fíìmù ogun abẹ́lé tí wọ́n ti jáde ní àwọn ilé ìṣeré Amẹ́ríkà níbi tí wọ́n ti ń gbìn ní gbangba ní àwọn ènìyàn bí ó ṣe lè jẹ́.
Well, if you had asked an American in the past whether...
Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni ó jiyàn pé pàápàá ní ọdún 2024 nígbà tí ìbò tí ó tẹ̀lé yẹn kí ó jẹ́ ìlọ́wọ́sí KGB yìí tàbí ipa jẹ́ ìwọ̀nba, ṣùgbọ́n ó ti jẹ́ ìgbáradì àyè náà fún wọn láti fi sínú olùdíje wọn ní 2028, àti pé ó jẹ́ ìgbáradì fún ogun abẹ́lé. Lákọ̀ọ́kọ́ tí ó jẹ́ pé kò sí ọ̀kan nínú àwọn ará ìlú Amẹ́ríkà lónìí tí ó lè fi ojú inú pé fíìmù yẹn ogun abẹ́lé jẹ́ ìtọ́sọ́nà gangan. Ó mọ̀ láti gbà sínú ọkàn àwọn ènìyàn kí wọ́n lè mọ̀ nígbà àkókò. Òótọ́ ni pé ní ti gidi ó dáa ó mọ̀ bí wọ́n ṣe ń ṣe nìyẹn, àti pé bí ó tilẹ̀ dàbí ẹni pé ó jẹ́ aláìgbọràn lónìí, bó tilẹ̀ jẹ́ pé a ti rí tẹ́lẹ̀ ni pé nítorí àwọn ìwọ̀ òṣèlú àwọn ìdílé kò ṣòro, àwọn ìjà wà níbẹ̀. Àwọn ènìyàn lọ sí àwọn ìjà. A lè ṣàfihàn àpẹẹrẹ kan fún àpẹẹrẹ. Ọdún 10 sẹ́yìn, tí o bá sọ fún àwọn ará ìlú Russia àti àwọn ará ìlú Ukraine pé wọn yóò para wọn yóò rẹ́rìn sí ọ, wọn ò fi ọ́ ṣe yẹ̀yẹ́ ni. Ó jẹ́ ohun tí kò ṣe ìtẹ́wọ́gbà pátápátá, àti lónìí a rí pé èyí jẹ́ òtítọ́, ó sì ti wá sí ìmúṣẹ. Ó dáa tí o bá ti béèrè lọ́wọ́ Amẹ́ríkà kan ní ìṣáájú bóyá ó wá fún ìpínyà ti Amẹ́ríkà, ó ń wá ìpínyà ti Amẹ́ríkà, tàbí bóyá àwọn ìpínlẹ̀ kan yẹ kí ó yapa kúrò nínú ẹgbẹ́ ti Amẹ́ríkà yapa irú ẹ̀, òun yóò kọ́ pàápàá ti jíròrò rẹ̀ pẹ̀lú rẹ̀, nítorí ìmọ̀lára tí ó wà níbẹ̀ ni pé Amẹ́ríkà ní àkọ́kọ́ àti ṣáájú àti pé Amẹ́ríkà jẹ́ ìlú ńlá àti nísinsìnyí wo bí ìtàn àkọọ́lẹ̀ yẹn ti yí padà àti wọ́n gbéraga láti jẹ́ ará ìlú Amẹ́ríkà wọ́n gbéraga láti kọ́ àgbáyé ńlá kan ilé tí àwọn ayé ti kọ́ tí kò lópin ó mọ àlà Amẹ́ríkà ó kan ẹnikẹ́ni tí ó fẹ́ wọ́n lè kàn sọ àsọyé ara wọn àti pé èyí jẹ́ ìran ìyanu àti ní ìpìlẹ̀ lónìí ó yàtọ̀ pátápátá lónìí àwọn èèyàn ń gbé nínú àgọ́ yìí àwọn ènìyàn gbà ní gbangba irú bí ìjà tiwọn wọ́n ní àwọn ìmọ̀lára àti pé ó ṣiṣẹ́ tààrà nínú ojú ìṣẹ̀lẹ̀ tí ó ti ṣètò nípasẹ̀ pínpín KGB èyí tí ó ń gbìyànjú láti nítòótọ́ ibi afẹ́dẹ́ àkọ́kọ́ ni láti gbẹ̀san ìjà náà ní ọdún 1991. Ó tó láti wo ohun tí ó ṣẹlẹ̀ ní Texas láìpẹ́ ní báyìí nítorí náà tẹ́lẹ̀ ìmọ̀lára láàrin àwọn olùgbé níbi tí gómìnà Texas ti sọ nǹkan kan tẹ́lẹ̀ sí ipa tí kò fẹ́ láti nítòótọ́ fi ara rẹ̀ sílẹ̀ sí ìjọba àpapọ̀ àti rí ìtàntẹ́lẹ̀ ní àwùjọ àti pé ó hàn ní ẹwà lórí máàpù èyí tí ó sọ Robert níbo ni àwọn ìmọ̀lára wọ́ wá níbo ni àwọn ìtara ti wá tí ó tẹrí sí Texas àti èyí tí ó tẹríba sí àwọn ọ̀nà àpapọ̀ ìyẹn ni láti sọ pé lákòókò ọdún díẹ̀ sẹ́yìn ó jẹ́ èyí tí a kò lè ronú lónìí à ń rí lágbàáyé àwọn ènìyàn sọ láti sọ dáadáa bẹ́ẹ̀ ni ó dàbí ìyẹn nígbà náà ṣùgbọ́n lẹ́yìn náà èyí ṣẹlẹ̀ àti lẹ́yìn náà ìyẹn ṣẹlẹ̀ àti pé ó yọrí sí bí díẹ̀ nínú wọn bí ìdínkù nínú ìṣesí ṣùgbọ́n kò sí ohun tí ó ṣẹlẹ̀ bí ìyẹn.
Secret forces in the form of KGB work. Exactly reveals the handwriting of this organization. And now it becomes all the information that surrounds us quite clear and understandable.
Do you know what that reminds me of? Do you remember that movie from Marvel, Captain America? This exact
àìtàsẹ́ra wá sí èyí ohun tí èyí ti hàn wá ní òtítọ́ pé kò sí ohun tí ó ṣẹlẹ̀ lásán àti pé ohun gbogbo ń ṣẹlẹ̀ fún ìdí kan àti pé ẹnìkan wà lẹ́yìn rẹ̀ tí ó wakọ̀ àti pé a ti mọ ẹni tí ìyẹn jẹ́ dá lórí fídíò Cholakian síbẹ̀síbẹ̀ níbi bí a ti jẹ́ ọ̀kan lọ nípasẹ̀ fídíò náà ó ti mẹ́nubà ní òtítọ́ pé ìkọlù ẹ̀dọ̀fù kan wà gẹ́gẹ́ bí ó ti wà ní àwọn ètò lápapọ̀ nítorí náà ní àwọn ọ̀rọ̀ mìíràn ó sọ ohun tí ó sọ pé wọn kò ní ìpìlẹ̀ wọn kò ní àwọn ààlà wọn kò ní kankan nítorí náà wọ́n ṣe ìfọkànsí láti ṣẹ̀dá àwùjọ tí ó ní agbára gẹ́gẹ́ bí mo ti sọ èmi kò fẹ́ North Korea kan níbí tí wọn yóò rìn ní àyíká àti kí ó gbé àti kí ó ronú nìkan ohun tí ó sọ fún ọ ní òtítọ́ ó mọ̀ pé à ń gbé ní ètò ìjọba tiwantiwa lónìí àti pé a gbọ́ ìmọ̀ràn pé àwọn ìlú ìṣẹ́jú 15 yóò wá pé ọwọ́ onínọ́mbà yóò wá tí ó lè jẹ́ ọ̀pá fún ìfi agbára tìmọ́lé tí àwọn olùgbé àti ti àwọn dájúdájú irú ohun ariwo sókè irú tí dinos ní ènìyàn àti pé èyí jẹ́ olóye gangan ti ẹgbẹ́ yìí nípasẹ̀ àwọn mídíà ń gbé sínú ọkàn ènìyàn kí àwọn ènìyàn fúnra wọn jẹ́ bí ó tilẹ̀ pé ó lòdì sí èyí nítorí náà láti sọ ètò tiwantiwa àti pé o mọ̀ nígbà tí o bá bá ènìyàn sọ̀rọ̀ dáadáa wọn yóò sọ fún ọ pé ìlú ìṣẹ́jú 15 jẹ́ ńlá ó fi pamọ́ àkókò púpọ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ ni ṣùgbọ́n ṣe àkíyèsí pé o fi òpin sí ara rẹ sí ipò kan àti pé o ti parí o kò lè lọ síwájú sí tí ń ṣe ó ó jẹ́ ibùjókòó ìfọkànsí onínọ́mbà kan.
As Cholakian explained in the video, actually, the KGB division is using to stay disguised and that no traces would lead to it.
Gẹ́gẹ́ bí Jọlá ṣe sọ nínú fídíò, nítòótọ́ pínpín KGB ń lọ láti wá ní ìyípadà àti pé kò sí àwọn ìtọ́pa tí yóò yọrí sí rẹ̀ tí à ń pè ní iwájú tàbí ti àjọ tí ó jẹ́ pé kò sí ẹnìkan tí yóò sọ pé wọ́n gan-an ni. Irú ètò bẹ́ẹ̀ àkọ́kọ́ tó mẹ́nu kàn ní ṣọ́ọ̀ṣì Orthodox ti Russia, èyí tí ó jẹ́ ìyàlẹ́nu fún mi tìkálára rẹ̀ nítorí ọmọ ẹgbẹ́ ìjọsìn kan, ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ àwọn onígbàgbọ́ àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ. Ìwọ kì yóò ti ronú nínú ìgbésí ayé rẹ pé ó jẹ́ ètò iwájú wọn nípasẹ̀ èyí tí wọ́n ṣe àwọn iṣẹ́ wọn, ṣùgbọ́n ó nífẹ̀ẹ́ sí i pé ọ̀kan nínú àwọn alákòóso ìjọba ti àwọn ìlú olómìnira Baltic pé ó ní irú àjọ apanilára àti pé ó fẹ́ láti fi òfin dè ní European Union àti pé a yóò dé ibẹ̀. Ìyẹn ni mo rí, mò ń sọ pé wò ó bí ohun gbogbo ṣe bẹ̀rẹ̀ láti ṣubú sí ààyè ọ̀tún, kì í ṣe ariwo nìkan, ṣùgbọ́n ní báyìí, nígbà tí o bá ń lọ nípasẹ̀ rẹ̀, ní pàtàkì ọ̀kọ̀ọ̀kan àti gbogbo nǹkan adojúrú kéékèèké ṣubú sí ààyè àti fún ọ ní àwòrán kan pàtó tí o faramọ́ fún ìgbà pípẹ́, àti gẹ́gẹ́ bí aṣọ ìkélé bẹ̀rẹ̀ láti sí dáadáa. Nítòótọ́ bí wọ́n ti sọ, o mọ igi kan nípasẹ̀ èso rẹ̀. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, àti pé ọ̀kan mìíràn ni ó mẹ́nubà, mo rò pé nínú fídíò yẹn náà ni. Àwọn ẹgbẹ́ alátakò wọ̀nyí jẹ́ àwọn àjọ tí ibi àfẹ̀dẹ́ àkọ́kọ́ wọn ní láti fi kún ipò àwọn ìjọsìn ìbílẹ̀. Ó túmọ̀ sí bí ìwádìí. Jẹ́ kí a sọ pé bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, ìyẹn gan-an ni. Nítorí kí wọ́n ba lè di ipò ẹ̀sìn ìbílẹ̀ mú, gbogbo ẹgbẹ́ ẹlẹ́sìn tuntun tó kù, ká sọ pé ẹgbẹ́ ẹlẹ́sìn ni wọ́n ti ń pè wọ́n tẹ́lẹ̀, ṣùgbọ́n ká sọ pé ẹgbẹ́ ẹ̀sìn tuntun ni wọ́n bẹ̀rẹ̀ sí í bú wọn lójú àti láti lè pa wọ́n kúrò. Eléyìí kọlù mí bí ẹ̀gàn àjòjì tí wọ́n ní, tí a pè ní ìtòsí lórí ìdí. Ọ̀kan lè sọ tàbí lórí ìtani, ẹni tí kìí ṣe àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, nítorí púpọ̀ jùlọ wọ́n jẹ́ kí a sọ àwọn amòye, wọ́n lè jẹ́ àwọn onímọ̀ ìjìnlẹ̀ sí ènìyàn tí kò kọ́ ẹ̀kọ́. Kí ló dé tí kìí ṣe? Nítorí náà ó dàbí pé wọ́n sọ̀rọ̀ dáadáa, wọ́n mọ̀ dáadáa, tàbí wọ́n mọ̀ mìíràn àwọn ẹ̀sìn wọn lóye àwọn ọ̀ràn náà, ṣùgbọ́n ibi
that they actually create an image of what one imagines a sect to be.
Ṣùgbọ́n ní ìpìlẹ̀ bí àwọn fúnra ọ̀hún tí ó wá, tí wọn kò sì ṣẹ̀dá ohun àwòrán tí ohun tí ọkàn èrò ọkàn láti wá. Nítorí pé nígbà tí mo bá sọ pé ẹgbẹ́ kí ni ó ya àwòrán, dájúdájú kò sí ohun rere, ó jẹ́ ohun òdì pátápátá. Àti ní òtítọ́, nígbà tí o bá mọ̀ pé ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ àwọn irú mídíà tí ó tọ́ka sí tàbí pàápàá béèrè lọ́wọ́ àwọn àgbéká egbòogi ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn wọ̀nyí lórí èrò kan nípa àwọn àgbéká ẹ̀sìn tuntun. Nítorí náà ni àwọn ọ̀ràn mìíràn ní ìpìlẹ̀. Èmi kò mọ nọ́mbà ti ìpín ọgọ́rùn-ún tí o kà nínú àwọn ìwé ìròyìn. Ọ̀kan tàbí ìkejì kò ṣe pàtàkì. Kíni jẹ́ láti ọkàn ènìyàn, ó wá láti ọ̀dọ̀ ọkùnrin kan àti pé ó ṣe ọ̀nà tí ó ṣe. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, tàbí ó lọ nípasẹ̀ àjọ egbòogi ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn yìí, àti pé ó ní àwọn àpẹẹrẹ èyíkéyìí tí àwọn ẹgbẹ́ alátakò wọ̀nyí.
But when you think about it, the Czech Republic and
àwọn egbòogi ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn wọn jẹ́ ti gbogbo ènìyàn. Wọn kì í ṣe àṣírí. Wọ́n ṣiṣẹ́ papọ̀. Wọ́n ṣiṣẹ́ ní ọ̀nà tí a ṣètò. Pàápàá ènìyàn kọ̀ọ̀kan ṣe pé iṣẹ́ ṣíṣe gidi ni wọ́n ṣiṣẹ́ papọ̀. Ṣùgbọ́n nígbà tí o bá ronú nípa
sí
Czech Republic àti Slovakia pàápàá àti ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ àwọn orílẹ̀-èdè mìíràn ní àwọn àjọ wọ̀nyí. Ohun àkọ́kọ́ tí ó ń ṣiṣẹ́ láàárín Yúróòpù jẹ́ FECRIS. Nítorí bẹ́ẹ̀, Russia ní ètò tirẹ̀ àti pé o lè rí àwọn ọ̀nà àsopọ̀ ní kedere. Ohun tí mo rí tó jàjèjì bó tilẹ̀ jẹ́ pé ní pé a ní àwọn àjọ tí ó jẹ́ òfin pàápàá tí ìpinnu wọn ní láti smear àwọn ẹgbẹ́ kan àti sàmì sí wọn. Púpọ̀ jùlọ bí àwọn ẹgbẹ́ wọn kò mọ ohunkóhun mìíràn ní ìpìlẹ̀, wọ́n máa ń wò ó gan láti ojú ìwòye ìsìn yẹn. FECRIS wà ní orísun ní Paris tí ó bá ti ẹ̀mí kọ àṣìṣe àti pé ó tún jẹ́ agbátẹrù, èyí tí ó súnmọ́ sí pé ẹni tí ń san owó orí Faransé ń sanwó fún àjọ ti ìjọba tiwantiwa. Èmi yóò sọ èyí tí ó ṣe àmì àti smart tàbùkù pàápàá wọn tí wọn kò bá ní wíwọ̀ ẹ̀sìn tí ó tó. Gẹ́gẹ́ bí èmi yóò ti sọ, ó dára wíwọ̀ ẹ̀sìn tí ó tọ́. Èmi kì yóò gbà á ní ọ̀nà yẹn nítorí pé wọ́n gbèjà ire àwọn ìjọ ìbílẹ̀, gba nọ́mbà tí ó kẹ́yìn ti àwọn ọdún. Mélòó ni ẹ̀sìn tàbí ilé ìjọba tuntun tí a ní tí yóò gbé kalẹ̀ ní mídíà bíi rere òdo nítorí ó dàbí ẹni pé àwọn tuntun tí ń yọ jáde ti wà ní panded láì fọwọ́yí àti pé wọ́n jẹ́ ẹ̀gàn láì fọwọ́yí sí ọ̀tún láti ìbẹ̀rẹ̀. Ṣé wọn kò tún ní irú aṣojú tàbí ìwọlé sí UN? FECRIS yìí wọ́n ní ìfọwọ́sowọ́pọ̀ tààrà wà bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, àti pé nǹkan yìí wá pé nípa smearing wọ́n ní àwọn ìtàn tí ó nífẹ̀ẹ́ púpọ̀. Ó kan ohun tí àwọn mídíà ń wá. Gẹ́gẹ́ bí mo ṣe sọ ní ìpìlẹ̀, àwọn mídíà wọ̀nyẹn ní ìtara púpọ̀ lórí títẹ̀jáde tàbí tọ́ka sí wọn. Ìfọ̀rọ̀wánilẹ́nuwò wọn béèrè lọ́wọ́ wọn fún èrò wọn lórí àwọn ẹgbẹ́ kan, àti nítorí pé ó jẹ́ àríyànjiyàn, àlàyé àríyànjiyàn púpọ̀. Ó ní àtẹ̀jáde ní àwọn mídíà wọ̀nyẹn àti àwọn àgbékà egbòogi ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn wọ̀nyí kì í ṣe nìkan ni wọ́n ṣe ṣẹ̀dá èrò yìí. Bí a ti sọ, mo gbàgbọ́ pé 95% ti àlàyé tí o ti gbọ́ tẹ́lẹ̀ nípa àwọn ẹgbẹ́ ti wá láti àwọn ẹgbẹ̀ka egbòogi ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn wọ̀nyí. Wọ́n ṣiṣẹ́ pẹ̀lú àwọn mídíà bí a ti sọ, ṣùgbọ́n wọ́n tún ṣe ìdíwọ́ pẹ̀lú òfin. Wọ́n lọ sí àwọn ẹjọ́ èyí tí ó lè já sí àwọn ìdánimọ̀ lórí àwọn àgbékà wọ̀nyí. Ó ń díbọ́n láti jẹ́ dáradára egbòogi ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn. Kò sí ẹnìkan tí ó ní òye tí ohun tí ó jẹ́ gangan àjọ tí kò léwu, ṣùgbọ́n wọ́n ṣe díẹ̀ nínú àwọn iṣẹ́ ìdọ̀tí gangan. Ẹ̀gbọ́n Cholakian mẹ́nubà nínú fídíò yẹn, àti pé a rò pé ó fi hàn pé ní òtítọ́ àwọn àgbékà alátakò wọ̀nyẹn jẹ́ irú ohun ìjà ní ayé ogún aláyé. Wọ́n wà níbẹ̀ tí kò sí nǹkankan ojú àmì gangan sí ọ̀nà KGB àgbáyé. Kí ni díẹ̀ sí fún ìgbà pípẹ́? Olùdarí FECRIS jẹ́ Cholakian, ẹni tí ó jẹ́ olùdásílẹ̀ ti ìyàtọ̀ Russia, èyí tí a sọ àwọn Rakis àti nítorí náà ní òtítọ́ wọ́n ti sọ wípé ìyẹn dá ọkàn mi lójú. Ó dára ní ìbámu sí ohun tí Cholakian sọ. Àjọ yìí ní Russia, Rakis, ìyẹn ní ẹgbẹ́ Russia tí àwọn ilé-iṣẹ́ fún ìkẹ́kọ̀ọ́ àwọn ẹ̀sìn àti àwọn ẹ̀yà. Wọ́n ṣe bí ó lè sọ bí alágbàwí kan fún ìjọ Orthodox ti Russia. Ìyẹn ni láti sọ, ó ṣẹ̀dá ààyè fún ilé ìjọsìn Orthodox ti Russia láti jẹ́ agbárí ìtẹ́wọ́gbà nìkan agbárí ẹ̀sìn ní Russia. Ó dára, ṣùgbọ́n kì í ṣe pé ó wà nínú òfin Russia pé ó ní òmìnira ti ẹ̀sìn. Wọn kò ní ẹ̀sìn aláìlẹ́sìn tàbí ẹ̀sìn ti ìjọba, nítorí ó dàbí ẹni pé ó wà ní ìpalọ́lọ́. Ó jẹ́ ìgbádùn púpọ̀ níbẹ̀ nítorí pé kì í ṣe ẹ̀sìn kan ṣoṣo ní Russia. Àwọn Mùsùlùmí wà, ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ àwọn ẹlẹ́sìn mìíràn wà, ṣùgbọ́n pàápàá bí Cholakian ṣe ṣàfihàn nínú fídíò rẹ̀ ní ìpìlẹ̀ lẹ́yìn alága Russia nígbà gbogbo wá, baba ńlá ti ilé ìjọsìn Orthodox ti Russia yìí wá, kò sí ẹlòmíràn. Lórí gbogbo rẹ̀, èèyàn lè sọ wípé àwọn àbẹ̀wò òṣìṣẹ́ kì í ṣe lórí gbogbogbò lórí ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ àwọn àbẹ̀wò òṣìṣẹ́, ṣùgbọ́n nígbà gbogbo nínú fọ́tò yẹn bí Cholakian ṣe fihàn àwọn fọ́tò yẹn nígbà gbogbo Kirill wà. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni, ṣùgbọ́n gba àìlágbára náà níbí nítorí àwọn lẹ́tà mélòó ni a ti kọ, ìyẹn ìgbà tí àwọn aṣojú tí àwọn ẹ̀sìn mìíràn ti súnmọ́, bóyá àwọn òṣìṣẹ́ UN tàbí mínísítà àjèjì Blinken, láti lásán sí rárá àǹfààní. Kò sí ohun tí ń yí padà. Ẹgbẹ́ kan tí àwọn ènìyàn tún wà tí ó tẹ̀síwájú àwọn iṣẹ́ ṣíṣe wọn ní ìpínlẹ̀ tí ń sàmì sí àwọn àgbékà mìíràn bí àwọn ẹgbẹ́, àti nítorí náà ṣíṣẹ̀dá ànìkànjọpọ́n fún ẹgbẹ́ kan tí ó sọ pé èyí ni ọ̀nà tí yóò jẹ àti pé ìyẹn ni. Níbo ni ọ̀pọ̀ wà nígbà náà? Báwo ni irú nǹkan bẹ́ẹ̀ ṣe lè wà ní àwọn àwùjọ tiwantiwa níbi tí ó ní òmìnira ti èrò, níbi tí ó ní òmìnira ti ẹ̀sìn? Báwo ni ìyẹn ṣe ṣeéṣe? Mo lè gba ẹnikẹ́ni tí mo bá fẹ́ gbọ́. Lẹ́yìn náà, kí ló dé tí a fi àmì síbi èyí, ìyẹn tàbí nǹkan mìíràn? Wọ́n tún ní agbára ńlá lórí àwọn àgbékà wọ̀nyí nítorí ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ àwọn ẹlẹ́sìn wà tí wọn kò bá sí èyíkéyìí ẹgbẹ́ tí ó lòdì sí ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn. Àwọn ni wọ́n tọ́ka sí kí ni àwọn àgbékà alátakò wọ̀nyí ṣe, ṣùgbọ́n wọn kò sọ irú pífù tí àwọn mídíà fẹ́. Nítorí náà ni òtítọ́ wọn kò ní àyè láti sọ ní mídíà. Àwọn egbògi ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn jẹ́ àsopọ̀ pátápátá sí àwọn mídíà wọ̀nyẹn, àti pé ó jẹ́ irúfin ńlá tí àwọn ètò ènìyàn. Ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ àwọn ìtọ́kasí lórí íńtánẹ́ẹ̀tì sí bí wọ́n ṣe ṣe, àti pé ó lòdì sí ìjọba tiwantiwa, ó lòdì sí àwọn ẹ̀tọ́ ènìyàn, àti pé wọ́n jẹ́ nítòótọ́. Nígbà tí a bá fọ́ ní báyìí, wọ́n lo èrò kan náà léraléra. Ìyẹn ni pé wọ́n kọ́kọ́ fẹ̀sùn èké kan ẹnìkan, lẹ́yìn náà wọ́n ṣe inúnibíni sí wọn, lẹ́yìn náà wọ́n fòfin dè wọ́n. Mo rò pé irú àpẹẹrẹ bẹ́ẹ̀ wà ní Russia pẹ̀lú àwọn ẹlẹ́rìí Jehovah. Wọ́n ti ní àwọn ìṣòro pàápàá títí di òní. Marek sọ pé èmi kò ṣe ààbò fún ẹnikẹ́ni, ṣùgbọ́n èmi kò rò pé wọ́n ṣe ìrọ́kẹ̀kẹ̀ ńlá àti bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ sí ẹnikẹ́ni, àti síbẹ̀síbẹ̀ wọ́n ti gbẹ́sẹ̀ lé ní Russia. Thomas wípé ṣùgbọ́n ó jẹ́ ìyàlẹ́nu, ó lè má jẹ́ àjọ ẹlẹ́sìn. Wọ́n tún lọ lẹ́yìn àwọn ilé-iṣẹ́ bíi Amway, Herbalife, àwọn ìpele púpọ̀ bí ìyẹn. Fún ìdí kan, èyí pẹ̀lú jẹ́ ẹ̀gún ní ẹ̀gbẹ́ wọn. Nítorí náà wọ́n ti mú un lọ, wọ́n sì ń lépa wọn kíkankíkan.
Labeled, one shouting this, the other shouting that.
Ó dára. Ní òtítọ́, ìsàmìsí yìí mú wa wá sí Alatra àti pẹ̀lú nígbà tí kì í ṣe ẹgbẹ́ ẹ̀sìn. Ìyẹn dára pẹ̀lú wọn. Wọ́n ṣe àmì rẹ̀ gẹ́gẹ́ bí ẹgbẹ́ ẹ̀sìn kí wọ́n lè lo gbogbo àwọn lẹ́tà wọn tí wọ́n lòdì sí àwọn àgbékà ẹ̀sìn, àti pé àwọn ènìyàn gbà dáadáa bí ó ṣe rí, àti pé bẹ́ẹ̀ ni ó ṣe rí ni ó ní láti wá, àti àwọn ènìyàn máa kọ mọ́ ní gbogbo ohun tí ó jẹ́ gan-an lẹ́yìn tí ó ti. Àti pé gẹ́gẹ́ bí Egon Cholakian ti sọ nínú fídíò náà, ní ìpínlẹ̀ Alatra ọ̀dọ́ àgùntàn kan tí a mú lọ sí pípa ní ìbẹ̀rẹ̀ fún pínpín KGB èyí tí ó tún bẹ̀rẹ̀ iṣẹ́ ní ọdún 1993 láti ṣàṣeyọrí àwọn ibi àfẹ̀dé rẹ̀, ṣùgbọ́n ní apá kejì, ọ̀tá wọn tún lo Alatra láti ní òye sí àwọn iṣẹ́ alátakò wọn àti àwòṣe nípasẹ̀ èyí tí wọ́n ṣiṣẹ́. Nítorí náà, a wà ní òsì láàárín àwọn òkúta méjì àti àmì. Ọ̀kan ń pariwo èyí, ìkejì ń pariwo òhun. Báyìí, ó ń parí jẹ́ òye ìdí tí èyí ṣe ń ṣẹlẹ̀.
Subsequently, the secular state media picked it up. And even in Ukraine, they started picking up the methodology of the Russian Orthodox Church, two states that stand against each other. But here, it didn't matter. Other countries started copying the exact same methodology that they started throwing at Alatra, which was introduced by the Russian Orthodox Church in its original and genuine wording. All journalists who have adopted this rhetoric of lies have adopted the methodology of the Russian Orthodox Church and Russiers, of which Dvorkin is the founder and leader.
A mentally ill man, by the way.
Yes, that was mentioned there too, that he has specific diagnosis of a mentally ill person. Even a team of doctors said that he should not hold public office. And he got away with it quite easily.
ṣùgbọ́n kí ni ohun mìíràn tí ó nílò láti sọ
How much money has
ni
been
pé
laid out to smear
ibi
Alatra? You get to $200
ibi
million,
afẹ́dé tí ó ga
may
afẹ́
seem like
dé tí ó ga jùlọ
a
ní
huge amount.
láti ṣẹ̀dá ohun
Some
tí
will say, well,
à ń pè ní
that's
totalitarianism
that's peanuts.
tàbí
Okay.
láti mú ènìyàn wá sínú
$200 million,
ìṣirò pípẹ́.
20,
Nígbà tí a bá ṣe
ballistic
àkíyèsí
missiles of a certain
kí ni
range.
gbogbo èyí yọrí sí,
They may win you,
àwọn iṣẹ́
but
wọ̀nyí
they won't win
àwọn
you.
ẹgbẹ́ tí ó lòdì
The
sí
$200
ẹgbẹ́
million
òkùnkùn
provided
ní
them with an
òtítọ́
acquisition of an
bíi
agency network as vast
fà á
as
kádẹ́
they could never have
bẹ́ẹ̀
dreamed of.
sí
That is money very well spent.
sí ṣọ́ọ̀ṣì
They have nothing
sí
to be ashamed
ṣọ́ọ̀ṣì
of.
That's right. Planning worthy
ìdérí tàbí
of
ohun
an
tí ènìyàn
intelligence
rí
agency.
ohun tí ó ń yọrí sí gangan ni
Revenge of a
ìhámọ́
faithful man.
tí òmìnira ẹ̀sìn
Yes. Offended,
àwọn
they
ìhámọ́
can't accept the fact
tí àwọn
that someone else ran them over.
ìwọ òmìnira tí ohun tí ènìyàn lè
That's right.
àti kí ó bá lè
And the
rọ̀
most terrible thing is that
ìfìyà
this is not only concerned
ìfìjìyà
Russia or different
inúnibíni
countries,
inúnibíni gbígbóná
but
gbogbo
also
ìwọ̀nyí
directly affects the Czech
jẹ́
Republic and Slovakia.
bẹ́ẹ̀
And we
sì
could say something
sọ̀rọ̀
about that too.
Well,
àwọn
let's do it.
àmọ́ tí ó sọ fún wa ibi tí èyí ń lọ.
So let's take Slovakia in more detail since
ní gbogbo ìgbà tí à ń gbé
We've talked
ní
about
àwọn
how it works in
àwùjọ
Russia,
tiwantiwa
how it works in the United States, how these organizations,
lákòókò tí à ń gbé ní àwọn àwùjọ tiwantiwa
and we see
Robert
exactly the
sọ
same
pé
pattern
a
that
tún
we
ti
discovered
parí
also in what's
a
happening
tún
in
ti pín
Slovakia.
káàkiri
So we could go and talk about
tí
well,
ó dá lórí àwọn
as Egon
òye
Cholakian spoke about that pattern,
ẹ̀gàn àti àlàyé láti
that
inú
is,
fídíò náà
first there was a
tí ó
smear,
bá
then
wo àkókò tí àwọn
state
àtẹ̀jáde
representative
àìbìkítà
raised
sí
concerns,
Alatra
then the security forces
àti
got
pín èrò
involved,
tí ó
and
lọ àti pé
then
kò sí
there was
bẹ̀rẹ̀
a
kò sì
trial.
bẹ̀rẹ̀ pẹ̀lú àwọn defamation.
Exactly the same pattern
ṣọ́ọ̀ṣì
took place in
orthodoxy
Ukraine
ti Russia
in the
ló
exact
bẹ̀rẹ̀
same
rẹ̀.
way.
Àwọn kan
First, there was a
smear
smear in the
àwọn
media
ìpolongo smear bẹ̀rẹ̀ sí
where
jáde
they started
àti
labeling,
díẹ̀ sí
changing
tàbí
narratives, and
kẹ̀rẹ̀ sí
then the
lẹ́yìn náà
member
àwọn mídíà ìpínlẹ̀ aláìlẹ́sìn gbé e
of
àti
Verkhovna
pàápàá ní
Rada said,
Ukraine wọ́n bẹ̀rẹ̀ gbígba
But she
ìlànà
had some concerns
ìlànà
and so
tí
on.
ilé
Exactly the same
ìjọsìn
narrative. Law enforcement
Orthodox ti
agencies,
Russia
our forces, and so on got involved. And we are beginning to see the exact same narrative here in Slovakia,
Orthodox ti
where the vilification
ilẹ̀
has begun in exactly the same
Russia.
way. But before we go into that, I would like to mention why it was important, that consistency, why it was Russia, where it started, why did it then go to Ukraine, and why to Slovakia? Why wasn't the consistency the other way around or different somehow? Well, because more or less,
Gbogbo àwọn oníròyìn tí ó
the European Union or into the democratic Western states,
àròsọ irọ́ yìí
and
ti
it
gba
won't get
ìlànà
there
tí
directly
ilé
from Russia,
ìjọsìn Orthodox
because
ti Russia àti
historically there were
Russia,
already
èyí tí
some frictions and
Di Fokin
disagreements
jẹ́
or different
olùdásílẹ̀
views.
àti
I
olùdarí.
mean, Ukraine was already important enough for the fact that it created sort of a link of how to get to the European Union, to a country in the European Union. And thus, it was very important not to fail there. That's why they used far harsher methods than in Russia. They could not use the narrative of the Russian Orthodox Church and these organizations, and so a narrative of the article from the Ukrainian constitution of high treason was used, because there was a war conflict going on, and therefore, if we look at the fact that most European countries or the whole Western democratic world has sided with Ukraine, it was used to transfer the rhetoric right here to us. That is to say, that consistency goes and has already been transferred to the European Union. And since the Czech Republic and Slovakia are the closest and the most interconnected when it comes to this Ukrainian crisis, we can see that it has...
Àti
And you've mentioned, Tomasz, one of the reporters who more or less started it.
It started with, or the first defamatory article I've noticed in
Thomas,
the
ó bẹ̀rẹ̀
Sesame
pẹ̀lú
News.
tàbí
That is the reporter,
nǹkan àbùkù
Mr.
àkọ́kọ́
Gavranov,
tí mo ti ṣe àkíyèsí ní àwọn mídíà,
who
àwọn
in a classic
ìròyìn
pattern refers to
Sesame
basically everybody.
ìyẹn ni oníròyìn ọ̀gbẹ́ni
Among other people, he
Gaveneni,
refers
ẹni tí
Mr. Vojtěch,
ní àpẹẹrẹ
who, as we
ayébáyé
said, is part of the anti-cult
tọ́ka
movement.
sí ìpìlẹ̀ gbogbo
This
ènìyàn.
Mr. Vojtěch
Láàárín àwọn
is
ènìyàn
regarded as
mìíràn,
an
ó
authority of
tọ́ka
sorts
sí
in
ọ̀gbẹ́ni
this area in general.
Volskeni
Exactly
gẹ́gẹ́ bí
as we
a
described
ti
with
sọ,
those anti-cult
jẹ́ apá
movements.
kan ti ẹgbẹ́
It's absolutely the
ògbólógbòó
same
ẹgbẹ́.
pattern. If you take the fact that you have a member or a preacher in some church,
Ọ̀gbẹ́ni
in
Fosi
his
yìí
case,
ni
the
a
Church of the Brethren,
gbà bí
and he
àṣẹ
has a
tí
degree
àwọn
in
irú
religious studies from some
ní
theological
agbègbè yìí
faculty.
ní
So he
àpapọ̀.
becomes an expert, and I would expect such an expert to be unbiased, to be objective,
Gangan
to
bí a
compare
ti
those
ṣe
movements,
àpèjúwe
to
pẹ̀lú
be
àwọn
interested in
àgbéká
them, to want to understand them, to know the differences.
egbòogi ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn wọ̀nyẹn.
But that's not the case there.
Ó jẹ́
Simply,
àpẹẹrẹ
this religionist is biased because he is a
kan náà
member
pàápàá.
and a preacher of the
Tí ó
church.
bá gba òtítọ́ pé
That to me
tí ó
is
bá
already
gba
an
òtítọ́
obvious
pé ó
clash
ní
of interests.
ọmọ ẹgbẹ́ kan
And
tàbí
in addition to
oníwàásù
those
kan
two things,
ní díẹ̀ nínú àwọn ìjọsìn
he
nínú
founded
ọ̀ràn
the
tirẹ̀
anti-cult
tí
movement,
ṣọ́ọ̀ṣì ti
or
àwọn
the
arákùnrin,
Society
àti
for
pé
the Study of Sects,
ó ní òye
and
nínú
new
àwọn
religious
ẹ̀kọ́
movements,
ẹ̀sìn
which of course,
láti
wherever something, a movement comes up,
àwọn ẹ̀ka ẹ̀kọ́
it
ẹ̀kọ́.
immediately gets a label.
Nítorí
Sect,
náà, ó di
totalitarianism,
àmọ̀ye.
extremist
Àti pé
sect, whatever.
èmi
For
yóò
me,
ní ìrètí
The overwhelming question mark was why
èmi
on
ò
earth
nírètí irú
was associated with
àmọ̀ye
this at
kan
all.
láti jẹ́
But he began to talk about us,
àìṣedéédé, láti jẹ́
to show how he really
ohun tó
creates
tọ́,
that opinion,
láti ṣe
how much of
àfiwé
an
àwọn
authority
àgbéká
he
wọ̀nyẹn,
is. I'll tell
láti
you that such a major
nífẹ̀ẹ́
news
nínú
portal in
wọn,
the Czech Republic,
láti
or
fẹ́,
one of the major
láti
ones,
lóye
as
wọn,
is
láti mọ
idnes.cz,
àwọn
has
ìyàtọ̀.
46
Ṣùgbọ́n
articles that take
ìyẹn
it
kì í
as a
ṣe
reference.
ọ̀ràn níbẹ̀.
So, in fact,
ní-
Mr. Gavranov
Nìkan
absolutely,
ẹlẹ́sìn yìí lè
logically, of
jẹ́
course, refers to him as well.
ojúṣàájú, nítorí pé
Well, again,
ó jẹ́
the
ọmọ ẹgbẹ́
language used
àti
by
oníwàásù
Mr.
ti ìjọ.
Vajicek is
Ìyẹn
not
sì
completely
mì
straightforward because
tẹ̀lé
he,
jẹ́ ìjà tí ó hàn
as the head of the
gbangba
department,
sí
cannot say
àwọn
some things in a
ìwúlò.
straightforward way.
Àti ní àfikún sí àwọn nǹkan méjì
But
wọ̀nyí,
those articles and
ó
statements
dá ẹgbẹ́
use
tí
such
ó
a hidden
lòdì sí
language
ẹgbẹ́ òkùnkùn
that in a
tàbí
way one gets an
Society
absolutely negative image from it,
for Study of
denigrating.
Sects and
And that's
New
exactly the
Religion
handwriting
Movements.
of the intelligence agencies, which means that even the reports that we have seen,
Àti pé ìyẹn gangan ni
it always starts with an
kíkọ́
article in some
ti
kind
àwọn
of
ilé-iṣẹ́ òye,
where
èyí
the
tí ó
articles
túmọ̀
are
sí
deliberately written
pé
using very
pàápàá
harsh
àwọn
terminology.
ìjábọ̀ tí a ti rí pàápàá ní àkókò nígbà gbogbo bẹ̀rẹ̀ pẹ̀lú nǹkan kan ní díẹ̀ nínú àwọn mídíà níbi tí a ti kọ́ àwọn kan
or to
náà
evoke a
ní
very strong emotion of fear,
ìmọ̀ọ́mọ̀
usually,
nípa lílo àwọn ọ̀rọ̀
and
tí
the
ó
associated
lágbára púpọ̀.
disgust towards the
Gẹ́gẹ́ bí ó
organization
ti
just by
mẹ́nubà,
looking at it.
ẹgbẹ́ lápapọ̀, ẹgbẹ́ tí ó
I
léwu,
really liked how in this video,
agbárí
Cholakian
ọ̀daràn
discusses specific
àti
scopes
bẹ́ẹ̀
of
bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ.
intelligence work,
Ìyẹn ní láti sọ,
where, for instance,
wọ́n
he
nílò
called one of these scenes
láti
a white thread sewn into
fún
black.
olùkà ní ìmọ̀ràn tàbí láti fa ìmọ̀lára tí ó lágbára púpọ̀ ti
This
ìbẹ̀rù
means that when they need to dehumanize
nígbà
an
gbogbo
organization,
àti ìkórìíra tí ó
they
so
usually
mọ́
put in the same
sí
article as
àjọ
some
náà.
other,
Nípa wíwò rẹ̀
perhaps already
nìkan,
publicly known
mo
organization
nífẹ̀ẹ́ púpọ̀
where something bad
bí
happened.
nínú fídíò yìí,
And they actually sort of distributed white thread like
Cholakian
a
ṣe
blank canvas.
ìjíròrò
That
àwọn
is,
ètò
when
kan
one looks from
pàtó
afar,
ti
one
iṣẹ́
sees a
òye,
gray canvas.
níbi tí fún àpẹẹrẹ
It
ó
blends
pe
in,
ọ̀kan
and
nínú
he
àwọn èrò
automatically
wọ̀nyí ní
associates, say, Alatra with some criminal
òkun
organization that he
funfun
already knows.
tí a rán
I think in the
sínú
beginning,
aṣọ dúdú.
in the very beginning,
Kí
they
nìyẹn
even
túmọ̀ sí?
associated Alatra with ISIS or
Èyí
something like
túmọ̀
that.
sí pé
And that
nígbà tí
means
wọ́n bá
that
fẹ́
one has to come
sọ
closer
àjọ
and dig
kan
deeper
di
into the issue,
Break it
ẹ̀dá
down.
ènìyàn,
and break it
wọ́n
down to
sábà máa ń
distinguish
fi
that
sínú
it's actually a
àpilẹ̀kọ
white
kan
thread sewn into
náà
black
pẹ̀lú àwọn
canvas.
mìíràn. Bóyá
This
àjọ
is the
tí a
handwriting
ti
of the
mọ̀
intelligence
tẹ́lẹ̀
agencies.
ní gbangba,
Another thing that's
níbi
used,
tí ohun búburú kan ti
another
ṣẹlẹ̀,
technique that Cholakian
àti pé
described,
wọ́n ní
is the
tòótọ́
so-called
irú
false victim
àránpọ̀
method.
nípasẹ̀ òkùnkùn funfun yẹn
That
bíi
is,
lórí
it's usually done in collaboration with renegades
káńfàsì
from some
dúdú.
organization.
Ìyẹn ni nígbà tí ènìyàn bá wò
And so in the case of
láti ọ̀nà
Alatra,
jíjìn,
it was a
èèyàn ní
particular folder
káńfàsì
member who,
grey
you
kan,
might say,
ìyẹn
didn't
ni ó
find what
ní
she was looking for,
dàpọ̀ mọ́ àti pé ó
and it found
darapọ̀ mọ́
fulfillment of her
láì
missions within the Alatra international public movement.
fọwọ́ yí sọ. Alatra
And now she's
pẹ̀lú
actually getting what
agbárí
she actually wanted.
ọ̀daràn kan tí ó ti
Right,
mọ̀
that is
tẹ́lẹ̀.
the spotlight,
A lot of attention.
the fame, the attention,
Mo rí i pé
recognition,
ìbẹ̀rẹ̀
the
ní
applause,
ìbẹ̀rẹ̀
and
pẹ̀pẹ̀
etc.
àwọn
And that it
ní
actually creates this
nǹkan
fake
tí Alatra
structure
pẹ̀lú
that doesn't even exist in
ISIS
reality.
Okay, but
tàbí
let's go step by
kankan
step so we
bí
don't get confused.
wípé àti pé ìyẹn túmọ̀ sí pé ènìyàn ò ní
The
láti
chronology is
súnmọ́
basically
kí ó
clear. But
jìn
notice
jinlẹ̀ sínú ọ̀rọ̀ náà
that first, and this
àti
wasn't that long ago, I think it was sometime in the spring of 2023, there was the
Robert ó
sort
fò
of a general
ó
article
lulẹ̀.
with a religionist on a reputable Slovakian portal. As it wasn't explicitly harshly critical, there were critical parts, but it was so intertwined that it was both yes and
Lẹ́yìn náà búlọ́ọ̀gì kan wà
and
tí
that's
ó
how it
jáde
was concluded.
ní àtẹ̀lé
Then
náà.
there was a blog
Lẹ́yìn náà níbi
that
tí
came
wọ́n
out
ti bẹ̀rẹ̀
on
láti
the next
jẹun
one after
ní
that,
díẹ̀ nínú àlàyé nípa
where they already
òtítọ́ pé
started to feed in
àwọn
some
ilé-iṣẹ́
information
òye
regarding the
Slovak
fact
ní
that
ipa
Slovak
nínú
intelligence
èyí
agencies were
èyí
involved in
àti
this.
bẹ́ẹ̀ bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ. Àti pé
And
síbẹ̀síbẹ̀
yet,
àlàyé
that
yẹn kò
information was never
jẹ́rìí
confirmed
sí i
anywhere,
níbikíbi
and it was only
àti
two
pé
journalists
àwọn oníròyìn
talking on the
méjì
blog.
nìkan ni ó sọ̀rọ̀
SME,
lórí
we can say
búlọ́ọ̀gì
that.
kan.
Yes, it was on SME.
SME a lè sọ yẹn.
And then there was
Bẹ́ẹ̀
silence
ni
for a long
ó
time
wà lórí SME
until
àti lẹ́yìn náà ó wà ní
in a way
ìpalọ́lọ́ fún ìgbà pípẹ́ títí.
events
Ní ọ̀nà kan,
in
àwọn
Ukraine
ìṣẹ̀lẹ̀
happened
ní
in terms
Ukraine
of
ṣẹlẹ̀.
starting that power phase. That is to say, the power
ṣẹlẹ̀
phase started
ní
there,
Ukraine
already
ṣẹlẹ̀.
specifically the persecutions, house searches, etc. And then at that
Tako
moment,
Alasra.
journalists in Slovakia started to actively denigrate Alatra.
Ta ni
Who took that on?
Yes, But the consistency
ta ló
is
gbà
exactly
yẹn?
like this. There is already this step
Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni,
here,
nítorí
and
náà
now
ṣùgbọ́n
in the next country we start with this step and we go.
Alaxera
It is organized,
Yes,
and that it is one director.
it actually started. But what struck me is that it wasn't even Slovak journalists, but the journalists from the Czech Republic, right? I mean specifically Mrs. Tsirakova, who up to that point, like in her career, hadn't dealt with sects and so on at all. Suddenly, she turned around, reoriented herself, and just before she started to be active in this field, she started to deal with sects.
Which is also the evidence that it's actually,
Well, it was mentioned by Cholakian in the video that actually this pattern is going on, that suddenly the journalist in question is completely refocused on a completely different topic that he hasn't studied in his life, hasn't done any reporting on, and so on.
and what I would also like to say is that another one of those steps that is actually being taken, that is, after these defamatory articles come out, I think it was on the 27th of February that we were approached by an editor of a public television asking us for an interview, that they're going to do a news report. On the 1st of March, 3 days after that, most of the official channels of Allatra and Creative Society were deleted from the TikTok platform, which means that obviously it was in somebody's interest not to allow people to get to the information directly, but to refer to them to these very disparaging, defamatory articles, which were already going to be transferred from the local or some private platforms to the public television platform at the next stage.
Okay, but there was an event that preceded that. In December, a Czech journalist, Tsirakova, came to interview specifically the participants who are in Slovakia. I would be interested to know how she actually found out where the participants were, because in reality, only the state institutions in Slovakia have that information. That's like someone coming to your house to ask you questions, but how did they find out where you live? That's not public information. So here you can see that they also have links to certain other institutions where they get their information.
Yes, it is actually not at all a common thing for a journalist or a reporter from another country to come and try to find out information about people somewhere else. This is very strange. And if we're playing investigative journalist here, it would seem to me the logical thing to do would be to go back to where it all started. Why didn't Mrs. Sarakova or somebody who came from a foreign country to work here to find out information, why didn't they go to the Chelyabinsk region to find out, right? To the town of Plast, where the first trial took place with our participant, which so far, as yet, is completely clarified. There are 1,000 question marks over it. Why? We skipped something in that investigative journalism.
And they all referred to the Chelyabinsk region. So not only in Russia, but they didn't even go to the trouble of denigrating Allatra. They also referred to it in Ukraine, to the Russian Orthodox Church. The BBC article also refers to the Chelyabinsk region in the conclusion, which we may come to, but this is very interesting. Take the fact that BBC, a medium in the UK, that has been actively supporting Ukraine during the war, so it refers to the Russian Orthodox Church. That simply doesn't bother anybody. There's such subtle nuances that when one approaches that black canvas, one begins to distinguish exactly between that white thread and that black canvas.
And then there was an article. The reporter was focusing on some climatic events, that he was an expert in this area. And now suddenly, the Chelyabinsk region. It was very, very suspicious.
This is exactly the style in which actually defamatory articles are written and defamatory news reports are made. That they create some kind of untrue, false image about some organization or about some topic. For example, the fact is that no one has been convicted in Ukraine yet. There has not been a trial yet. But the Czech journalist, and also one could say Slovak journalists, and are talking about it as if it were a done deal. That simply Allatra is a criminal organization, and I do not know what. So they're violating the basic rules and the presumption of innocence.
Okay, so let's summarize. In December, Tsirokova comes to do a news report. A news report that is obviously manipulatively edited comes out. There are various insertions that are given as a fact, and yet, when we look at some of those statements by other government officials in Ukraine, and in fact, they only mentioned what is happening. It wasn't at all, yes, that it's already been decided that way. But she presented it as a fact. Then we were contacted, just as you said, by the state television asking for an interview with the coordinators of the Creative Society in Slovakia and, of course, Allatra alongside that. And then, as this request came in, to which we said, okay, we'd be happy to meet and to explain some of the information and questions that you may have, then subsequently to that, the TikTok accounts were deleted so that the information could not be given out amongst the people. After the editor of RTVS came to do a news report where there was such a confrontational exchange of opinions, where we explicitly asked her on what basis she was going to do a news report with us, since no one had confirmed it so far. And most importantly, what we were interested in, because in the meantime it turned out that she had said that she wanted to do a news report with us and with the coordination center or somewhere that is in Bratislava, and it turned out that she had been trying to break into homes in eastern Slovakia where refugees or people who had been granted asylum or protection from the war in Ukraine by the Slovak Republic live. What was she doing there? On what basis? Why did she go there? When we confronted her with this, it resulted in her being very taken aback with the fact, where did we get this information from? And her reaction revealed that she had been given the exact information about where to go and where to try to get additional footage. Having said that, she had shot footage of the housing of one, of the other, showed it in the news report, which in fact is also a violation of journalistic ethics, etc. How can she just come in and say, here lives this and that person? He's not a public official, he's no one special, he is a person who uses the protection of the Slovak Republic, just like any other citizen. And the second thing is, right after the report, when it was filmed, there was a period of 2 weeks in which another news report was published completely outside the RTVS coverage, under the lamp, where coincidentally Mrs. Tsirokova was invited as a guest.
That was Dinner with Havran.
Ah, yes, Dinner with Havran, exactly, I'm sorry. And that's why Mrs. Tsirokova was invited there, and the whole news report was conducted in the way that they were there, they were talking about two more, like, sects or something, but the whole thing was conducted in the way that, as you mentioned, that you'll put one organization that we know is a sect, another one that we know is a sect, and then you'll insert Allatra in between, so that the viewer gets the impression that it's also a sect. They also invited a representative there, a church representative, I'm just wondering if the gentleman in question realized that he was actually defending the interests of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Right. What else should be mentioned is that all these reports have one common handwriting, which is proof that they still showed the same experts.
Yes, each other.
Still the same experts. When the first report came out in Slovakia, it referred to Mrs. Sidorkova to Mr. Wojtyszek, who referred indirectly to the aforementioned Dvorkin.
Dvorkin?
Exactly. Because he's a follower of Dvorkin's, who's his mentor of some sort. And what I would like to say is, what I found quite interesting, and we'll get to that later today, public television invite representatives of private media. Reporters from private media who, you could say, in the past, have not done the kind of work they're commenting on this report.
Yes.
If we take, for example, the security analyst, Mr. Branik, who is a blogger for this daily newspaper, SME, and contributes to Tishtan.sk, and he comments on some security threat from Alatra.
I'm wondering whether he worked in the security services or intelligence organizations at all.
Well, that is... And then we have an ethnologist who happens to be political candidate of Progressive Slovakia Party. And then, of course, there's Mrs. Sidorkova, who has been subject for several reports in the Czech Republic because of prejudice and biased information. So it then comes down to the question of whose interests the public television is pursuing and what objectives it is pursuing. And we will come to that.
And I'll add that actually after the TV show with Havran, Sidorkova is again releasing a report where she actually denigrates Alatra in Ukraine. And it can be said that on the basis of her report, the representative of the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada, the deputy who initiated the whole thing, is immediately making a statement saying that there is still no decision, no trial, nothing, that it is still only at the stage of investigation, as if she were already eager, indicating that it needs to wrap up already, because we need a trial.
So, the politician is pushing
the investigators and the law enforcement agencies to basically already deliver the verdict that they need.
Right. That would be the next step in here as well.
And that would be the next step for sure.
After the news report on public television, which we could perhaps dwell on a little more, what was interesting and what shows the bias and one-sidedness of this report is that Mrs. Penchatova, the editor, filmed us for 2 hours of material, and yet only exactly 1 minute and 42 seconds was used. Each one of those, you could say, clippings that she used lasted an average of 3 to some 7 seconds, and was inserted between 2 negative statements by these different analysts.
Yes.
Who, from my point of view, are not interested in making sense of it, what Alatra is about. But they've been given a clear order to classify Alatra movement as a cult and dangerous and so on, and to smear the name and create public opinion that is a dangerous organization, that is a security threat, and I don't know what else. What was also very interesting is the fact that this whole report was based on the false claims that Alatra was being investigated by the Slovak police throughout the whole report. The phrase that the Slovak police had been alerted to the movement was used several times. What I would like to say is that nobody said that this was actually an article by Mr. Pukovsky, who managed their Facebook pages Fraud and Hoaxes. It was never some sort of, you could say, official statement from the police. No one from the police has contacted us officially yet. nor has anyone been contacted, let alone the police have had any dealings with us or investigating anything. So again, an attempt to feed the public false information about some kind of security threat, which in principle goes exactly according to the handwriting that took place both in Russia and in Ukraine, and which, as we will go on to discuss, is directed towards the other objectives of this organization.
And one of the goals is basically, again, camouflage, camouflage, camouflage. It was mentioned in the RTVS news report how much money has been paid to refugees who are actually tried for terrorism in Ukraine and are hiding here. However, the fact that this money was paid by the Slovak government to Slovak citizens who are providing them with accommodation was not mentioned.
That's the case with all refugees, actually.
Exactly. It is just the way the program works, that Slovak citizens who provide accommodation for those who have left Ukraine receive a contribution from the Slovak government. The amount was voiced. It was a big, huge amount. But what struck me was that it gives the impression, and now we will show the parallel, it gives the impression that the Slovak government supports, and it is the bad one, and is funding, allegedly, a criminal organization. And notice what followed on RTVS after the part of the report about Alatra was over. Immediately they showed that a man had died in the hospital, whom nobody had noticed in the corridor there. Another narrative that shows the state of the Slovak healthcare, the inability of the Slovak government and Slovak ministries to take care of its citizens. So this is another narrative that ultimately they are climbing on the back of Alatra to the point to be able to attack the Slovak government, which, by the way, was elected by the citizens of the Slovak Republic in a free election. I mean, they are our representatives. And by what right does anybody allow themselves, quasi-Slovak state television, to post and attack the Slovak government?
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. But it's exactly this narrative, and it fits exactly the work of the KGB, as does the terminology used by reporters, both in Russia and in Ukraine, and suddenly also in Slovakia. These are exactly the same questions, you could say, only translated into Slovak, and the same questions are being asked. There it is being asked, here it is being asked, there you ask it, and it was still the same answer. So then, what kind of investigative journalist are you? I'll tell you about one more such story that I had with an acquaintance who went to work for the United Nations in New York, who said that journalists no longer. In fact, he refuses to speak to journalists, and the reason that he gave was that reporters as such have ceased to exist. Even in schools, they are not taught to become reporters, but to become, he called it, novelists, or Pavel Dobshinsky's storytellers, where they are given a story and the result that the story is supposed to achieve, and then they subcontextualize that story so that it leads to what they need. So that's another fact of reporters not doing their job the way they are supposed to.
Exactly. And they're paid agents who spread disinformation and create public opinion, so that people themselves are then set against each other, so that ultimately the people themselves are the initiators of, say, some riots or the overthrow of the government, and so on.
Because that information can be conveyed in 1,000 different ways. whether about those posts you were talking about or about that man in that hospital. But those reporters, when they use that kind of framing of a certain topic, of their agenda, it may not be immediately apparent to a normal person. But when he sees it, this scheme on one, on the second, on the third, on the fourth case, and he sees where it's all going, it's not going in a good direction at all.
And people don't actually realize it at all. A lot of people may say to themselves, what do I care about LATRA? At least there will be one less organization. But people don't realize what the next steps are. That we can realistically get into the situation that Ukraine is in today. That there may be civil war that may actually result in riots and fratricide. Because what is the aim? The aim is to absolutely polarize society. For example, look at how people behave towards each other today. For example, who are in favor of those political parties, which have a pro-Western narrative, and those which they accuse of having a pro-Russian narrative. After all, people do not talk to each other. There are conflicts within families, between colleagues. Every time they get on this wave, on this policy issue, there is an absolute clash of interests, and they can be almost violent, you could say.
Now take this. After all, we are Slovaks. We should first and foremost defend the interests of the Slovak Republic.
And we defend them.
And not the left or the right. Residents and our fellow citizens should realize that we are first and foremost citizens of the Slovak Republic, and we have to defend the interests of Slovakia. And let me tell you, I think it will be very difficult for the Slovak government to identify and cleanse the media space and other sort of parts of the structure, whether it is the state administration, etc., from those agents who are involved in this intelligence network.
Exactly. Because if you take even just a live article on the Facebook page of the police hoaxes, we have warned. We have sent an official letter to the police asking them to take it down. And so far, absolutely no response. Which proves that there are still KGB agents in the ranks of police working on some plan of their own. And with that, perhaps it would be a good idea to appeal to the Ministry of Interior of Slovak Republic to shine a light on its ranks, that is, who they are playing for.
Yes, it's quite obvious to us because the administrator of that Facebook page is already doing something completely different. In my opinion, the Minister of the Interior spoke quite strongly when he disagreed with what was going on that Facebook page. And yet, that Facebook page is still there.
It still exists for some reason. And what else I would like to comment on? Consider that, in fact, these media that we have mentioned, one could say the very same journalists, what they do, what articles they write, and what tendencies they provoke in masses. For example, after the elections that were held in Slovakia, whether they were parliamentary elections or presidential elections. In the parliamentary elections, SMER won with a democratic majority and formed a government. Similarly, in the presidential elections, Pellegrini won by a democratic majority and will be Slovakia's president. What news is being spread by these media? And not only by the private media. That is a whole another story. After all, the representative
ó tún wà fún ìdí kan
he would not answer questions
àti
from newspapers.
kí ni ohun mìíràn
SME.
èmi yóò fẹ́ láti sọ
Which are the exactly
àsọyé
the same media outlets
gbé
that
èyí
provide
yẹ̀wò
negative
ní
opinions of
ti
people
gidi
about Allah.
àwọn iléeṣẹ́ agbéròyìnjáde tí a mẹ́nu kàn yìí
And it's already
ẹnìkan
in
lè
the
sọ
public
àwọn
institution.
akọ̀ròyìn
Feedback
kan
element.
náà
I think
ohun
even
tí
the
wọ́n ń
picture
ṣe
mentions something there about
àwọn
deeply
àpilẹ̀kọ
cleaning.
wo ni wọ́n ń kọ
And I'm not surprised
àti
at all.
àwọn
After all,
ìtẹ̀sí
they're doing sabotage
wo
practically.
ni wọ́n ń ru
They're
àwọn
actually
ènìyàn
bringing in
sókè
representatives or
bí
reporters from
àpẹẹrẹ
private media
lẹ́yìn ìdìbò tí ó
and
wáyé ní
presenting
Slovakia
interesting activities there.
bóyá wọ́n jẹ́ àwọn
Yes,
ìdìbò
but
ilé
consider
ìgbìmọ̀
this. They are
tàbí
using LATRA
àwọn
to
ìdìbò
portray
ààrẹ
ours
nínú àwọn ìdìbò ilé
of their
ìgbìmọ̀
anti-state
aṣòfin
activities.
SMER borí
So,
pẹ̀lú
Here, they're
ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀
dragging you in
tiwantiwa
and using the
àti
same
ìṣètò ìjọba náà Bákan náà
format
ni
and
àwọn
narrative to begin to
ìdìbò
create
ààrẹ
exactly
Pellegrini
the same
borí
ground in
nípasẹ̀
Slovakia,
olójú ìjọba tiwantiwa àti pé yóò jẹ́
that
alákòóso
they did both in
Slovakia.
the Russian Federation
Àwọn
and
ìròyìn wo ni
Ukraine.
àwọn mídíà ń tàn káàkiri?
And I'd like to
Kì í
add
ṣe
one more
nípasẹ̀
thing
àwọn
here.
mídíà
I feel
aládàáni
that
nìkan.
in all of these
Ìyẹn
reports,
jẹ́
there is the
ìtàn
exact
mìíràn.
same
Lẹ́yìn náà,
message that the government is the
aṣojú
bad
ti
one, the government is the one that
FICO
doesn't act, and
FICO
that goes
sọ
back
pé
to
òun
exactly
kì
what
yóò
Egon
dáhùn àwọn
Cholakian said
ìbéèrè
in his
láti
videos,
àwọn ìwé ìròyìn
that people will
kan
start
gẹ́gẹ́ bí
demanding, or they will
Denic
start
N
just asking for the government to
SME
change because
àti
it's
pé
not acting
èmi
and so on.
àti pé
But
èmi
it
kò
was a
mọ
free election,
kí ni
so
ohun
in the
mìíràn
next election you can
èyí tí ó
express
jẹ́
another opinion.
déédéé
But at the
àwọn
moment we have this government,
mídíà kan náà
and
tí ó
that's
fa
basically
àwọn èrò
unchangeable.
òdì nínú ènìyàn
Exactly.
nípa
But the
Alatra
thing is,
àti pé
the
ó
same
ti
narrative that
ó ti wà
they're using
tẹ́lẹ̀
against Electra,
pàápàá ní ilé-iṣẹ́
that were
gbogbo
like a pro-Russian site,
tẹlifíṣọ̀nù
the same
Slovakia.
narrative is actually used
Mo
against
rò
the
pé
prime
ní
minister and
FICO
the whole government.
mo rò pé àní FICO dárúkọ
That is being labeled as a
nǹkan kan
pro-Russian
níbẹ̀
just because they
nípa
want a
àwọn yẹn
peaceful solution.
láti nù ú sókè
They want
àti
the
pé kò
conflict situation to be
yẹ
resolved at the
mí
negotiating
rárá.
table.
Lẹ́yìn náà wọ́n ṣe
Also, with
sabotage
Electra and the creative society,
ní
we talk about the need for peace,
iṣẹ́.
the need for
Wọ́n
an
mú
end to
àwọn
all
aṣojú
wars,
àti àwọn
and we're
oníròyìn
also
wá
labeled
nítòótọ́
as actually a
láti
pro-Russian
àwọn
site.
mídíà aládàáni àti
So it is
ṣàfihàn
exactly the
àwọn
same
iṣẹ́
narrative that is being used by
àtakò
these paid actors,
ìpínlẹ̀ níbẹ̀.
these KGB
Robert:
agents, to subvert society
Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni,
and to
ṣùgbọ́n
create
ṣe
totalitarianism.
àkíyèsí èyí, wọ́n lo Alatra láti
I
jẹ́
have
tíròjánù
one more piece of
sí
information
àwọn
here. As
iṣẹ́
Prime Minister Fico
egbòogi
said
ìpínlẹ̀.
that it
Nítorí
will be
náà,
necessary to
wọ́n
quickly
fà á
resolve the
wọ́n
illegal
fà
political
á
activities
sínú
of
ibi
RTVS,
àti lílo ọ̀nà
and especially
kíka
the illegal political operation
kànnàkànnà
of RTVS.
àti
That
ìtàn
is to
àkọlé
say,
àti
they were actually preparing an
bẹ̀rẹ̀ láti
operation
ṣẹ̀dá
and they
ilẹ̀
wanted to
kan náà
create
ní Slovakia
they
àti
would
láti ṣe
completely
àwọn iṣẹ́
overthrow the
àti
government
àwọn
or to
iṣẹ́
create a
kànnàkànnà tí
situation
wọ́n
where
ṣe
there would be
méjì
unrest.
ní Russia
That
Federation
is,
àti ní
in
Ukraine.
this way, they are
Àti pé
inciting violations
mo
of
fẹ́ láti
constitutionality,
ṣàfikún ohun
violations
kan
of the law,
sí níbí yìí.
so
Mo rí
that
i
they
pé
can then
nínú
apply
gbogbo
this same
àwọn
model
ìjábọ̀
in other
wọ̀nyí,
European democratic countries.
ìfiránṣẹ́ kan náà ni ó wà
So
pé
Slovakia
ìjọba
is a
kò
bridge
dára,
Yes.
ìjọba ní
for
ẹni
KGB
tí
to
kò
operate
ṣiṣẹ́
in
àti
Europe
pé ìyẹn padà
and
sí
in a democratic,
déédé ohun tí
Western
Egon
democratic world.
Cholakian sọ nínú àwọn
I
fídíò
will add
rẹ̀
one
pé
more thing
àwọn
to
ènìyàn
what I
yóò
said. This division of
bẹ̀rẹ̀ ìbéèrè
society,
tàbí wọn yóò
there are
kàn
now
bẹ̀rẹ̀
organizations
béèrè
that
fún
study
ìjọba
that
láti
level
yí
of
padà
cohesion
nítorí kì í
among
ṣe
citizens. That is, when the
iṣẹ́
cohesion is
àti bẹ́ẹ̀
highest,
bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ,
it's
ṣùgbọ́n ó
basically when
jẹ́
the creative
ìdìbò
period,
ọ̀fẹ́. Nítorí
people
náà,
are in a
ní
positive mood,
ìdìbò
they're
tí ó ń
working together,
bọ̀,
they're
kò lè
cooperating, that
ṣàlàyé
state
èrò
and
mìíràn,
that
ṣùgbọ́n
country is
ní
actually
àkókò
progressing.
yìí ni a
And
ní
then
ìjọba
when
yìí
it's at its
àti pé
lowest,
kò lè yí padà.
that's when society is completely
Marek
polarized, divided.
gangan.
And according
Ṣùgbọ́n
to their information, we are
ṣe
already
àkíyèsí
at
èyí,
such a
ìtàn àkọlé
low
kan náà
stage
tí wọ́n lò
that
lò
precedes
lòdì sí
revolutions or
Alatra
civil wars.
pé ó
So
dàbí
my
ẹgbẹ́
question is,
tí ó
what is
ní
being
àtìlẹ́yìn
prepared
Russia.
here?
Ìtàn
It just
àkọlé
doesn't
kan náà
happen by chance. I was talking to an acquaintance yesterday who was
ìtàn àkọlé
saying
kan náà
that
ni
it has
a
gotten
lò
to
ní
such
tòótọ́ lòdì sí Prime
absurdities
Minister àti gbogbo ìjọba
that
ìyẹn
kids
ni, àti pé
lock up their
ní
parents so they
ìtara
can't go to
bí ẹni
vote.
tí ó jẹ́ àtìlẹ́yìn ìlú
Just
Russia
take what they were
nítorí
doing
pé
in the
wọ́n
school
fẹ́
as well.
ojútùú àlàáfíà.
How they
Wọ́n
were
fẹ́ kí
simply
ipò
brainwashing young
rògbòdìyàn
people
yanjú
with false information.
ni tàbí ìdúnàádúrà pàápàá láàrin Alatra àti
What I
àwùjọ
liked the most was when they
ṣíṣe ẹ̀dá.
associated some stupid
A
person
sọ̀rọ̀
with a
nípa
fix of
ìwúlò
voodoo.
fún àlàáfíà, ìwúlò fún òpin sí gbogbo
Then
àwọn
this
ogun,
image was
àti pé
created in
a
society
tún
by
jẹ́
using these special
àmì
techniques of
bíi
intelligence agencies
gangan ẹgbẹ́
to
pro-Russia
instill
kan.
a certain idea
Nítorí náà,
into the
ó
consciousness
jẹ́
of
ìtàn
people,
àkọlé kan náà tí ó jẹ́ lílò
who then do not
nípasẹ̀
even think
àwọn
about whether it is true or
olóòtú
not.
sísanwó wọ̀nyí.
One draws a quick
Àwọn aṣojú
conclusion, and
KGB
that's it.
wọ̀nyí
And he has no
láti
idea that his
yí
conclusion
àwùjọ
has been
padà
prepared in
àti
advance.
láti ṣẹ̀dá ìsọdọ̀kan.
So,
Robert,
in other words,
mo
we
ní àlàyé
citizens
kan
should
díẹ̀
not all just
sí
ignore
níbí
it.
yìí. Gẹ́gẹ́ bí Prime
When we
Minister
see that
Fico
something
ti sọ
illegal,
pé yóò jẹ́
unconstitutional is
dandan láti
happening and we
yára
should do it,
yanjú
even though a lot of people
iṣẹ́
will say, well, there's no
ìṣe
point in that.
ìṣèlú
No.
arúfin ti
always turn to the
RTVS
police,
àti ní
to law enforcement,
pàtàkì
or
iṣẹ́
simply
ìṣèlú
to
arúfin
representatives in the
ti
government, representatives in parliaments, or
RTVS.
regional councils.
Ìyẹn ni pé wọ́n ń gbáradì
Ask
iṣẹ́
them what is
kan
being done
nítòótọ́
about
àti
this
pé
issue,
àwọn náà fẹ́ láti ṣẹ̀dá tí kò bá ṣe
whether they have been
pátápátá
wrongly
tí kò
accused,
bá ṣe
whether they have
àdéhùn
been unfairly
pátápátá
slandered, or whether such and
ìjọba
such articles
láti
have been published about
tàbí
me
láti
that do
ṣẹ̀dá
not
nǹkan
correspond to the
ipò
truth.
ibi
So we as
ipò
citizens
ibi
should really
ibi tí
not
yóò
only just
tí
pay
yóò
attention
gbòdìyàn
to
náà
this,
máa já sí ọ̀nà
but
yìí
we should
fa àwọn
consistently go
irúfin
after
ti
it when
òfin
something like this
irúfin òfin
happens,
kí wọ́n lè
because
lẹ́yìn
only
náà
we can
lọ
thus
àwòkọ́ṣe kan náà ní
ensure
àwọn
that
orílẹ̀-èdè
there is
tiwantiwa
no free scope for certain
Yúróòpù mìíràn
operations
Marek
which are consistently breaking the law.
gangan
that are consistently
nítorí náà
breaking the law.
Slovakia ní
Even just the
afárá
presumption of innocence.
fún
After all,
KGB
we should
láti
be the
ṣiṣẹ́
ones
ní
who should
Europe
be interested
àti
in
ní
drawing
ìjọba
consequences against
tiwantiwa
those who violate the
àgbáyé
presumption of innocence
tiwantiwa
because
ìwọ̀
they're
oòrùn.
acting illegally.
Robert èmi yóò ṣàfikún ohun kan sí i tí mo sọ pé pínpín àwùjọ yìí
One more interesting fact to our discussion that was voiced in Egon Cholakian's video, in which he actually said that in Slovak universities are recruited foreign intelligence agents, and we found out who he was actually talking about. I mean, I looked it up, and it's even publicly available there. Dvorkin was given Doctor honoris causa at the University of Prešov. That is, Dvorkin, who is a hardline anti-cult figure and who considers Johannes Agard his mentor in this area, who in turn also has very hardline anti-cult rhetoric as well. Dvorkin literally admires him, and Agard is the one who declared the First Amendment in the American Constitution to be a First Amendment neurosis. He'd probably most likely to repel it.
This Agard is also referred to by Mr. Vajicek, a religionist in the Czech Republic, whom we have been talking about.
Now, wait a minute, I'll look in these notes of mine what I have found.
The connection.
It's remarkably well connected.
That is, Dvorkin, as we already know, is a person directly subordinate with the hidden KGB controller, which means that in addition to that, Dvorkin's organization, Rasirs, which is actually an offshoot of Fekris, the Russian offshoot of Fekris, is thus connected to the Moscow Patriarch Kirill. And now, his right-hand man, Dvorkin's man, is actually Alexander Novopashin, who is known for his strong anti-Ukrainian narratives in which he calls Ukrainians cannibals and so on. We come to this stage at the end, and at the beginning, the reporter Sirokova, who claims to be advocating pro-European values and so on, is referring to them indirectly by that, or simply drawing on them. And one more interesting thing we found, that Novopashin was awarded the Order of Friendship in 2023 by Sergei Kirienko on behalf of Vladimir Putin himself. This means that Kirienko, who is now the first deputy head of the presidential administration of the Russian Federation, has direct links to people who are either directly controlled or even involved in the KGB network. And in the Russian Federation, Kirienko often takes decisions of national importance and nature on his own behalf. That is, without asking anybody for anything, he just assigns, I don't know, such and such an organization, this, assigns this to that organization. That means that We now also understand that behind state leaders and around them there are people who can feed them certain narratives without those politicians knowing it.
That is, who actually has a power in that state?
Yes, that is in fact even here, not all journalists are necessarily involved. Some may even do this unknowingly because they think that they are following a certain lead or narrative, but they do not understand at all what they are following. They just blindly take it and give it, without analyzing it and doing it. And that fits with what I told you about what my friend said, that journalists and reporters are extinct, that they just don't exist anymore.
Although there are certainly still some honest journalists, and we have also labeled many journalists here as KGB agents, but it has to be said that definitely not all of them are, because we know how it works, that today, in order to keep a place, or to be still in, a journalist looks out for the most up-to-date news. And it is enough that one is paid to leak this information, and the others automatically take it over. So nothing is black and white. We have also commented here about the fits of voters. So, on the other hand, in order to remain objective, it must be said that there are also those who are labeled as snowflakes. But all this actually, what does it prove? What it proves is, as such, you could say, emotional terms are used to polarize society, to make people hate each other.
It's just not that transparent. You can't see it at a first glance. But we do have our leaders, those who are obviously tarnishing it. Or just even those who just take and copy some articles without verifying it. They are basically playing into the hands of that KGB organization, like there's nothing to discuss. But as Cholakian was saying, basically, there has to be an investigation, and we are relying on the authorities there, and gradually, it will be uncovered. Gradually, they will all be uncovered.
And we know that the investigation is ongoing. I myself am looking forward to the outcome. Even if it's, I don't know, in a year, in 2 years, I'm curious actually to see what it will be achieved.
Well, yeah, but most importantly, that's exactly how agent recruitment works in the intelligence world. It is never done directly. It never happens like, come work for us. It's always done so covertly that even the person who has been recruited often doesn't even know about it. And only when the task for which he was recruited occurs, then he suddenly finds out that he's already in that network, simply that he's already stuck there. And that's exactly, this system works to keep, let's say, journalists like Tsirokova, Benchatova, some religionists, who are connected to somebody stuck in their network. And the moment when they are needed to fulfill the task required of them, they are already recruited and can no longer back down.
Well, why can't they back down?
You know what, I'll tell you, one Czech spy who deserted, he described it perfectly in his memoirs. That just like that, somebody comes to you and asks you for a favor or asks you for something to write because, I don't know, there's a situation and it's in your, setting, right? So you are like, yeah, sure, great, no problem, I'll help, I'll fix it.
And that's their job, right?
And of course, either you do it that way, or on the other hand, they will pay you for it. Like, oh great, we'll pay you for it because we need to get the article out and so on. And there's even an invoice, there's already an order and everything. And subsequently, there will be a couple of those, and then he says, and all of a sudden the same person comes up and says, well, tell me the length of the runway at the military airport in Kuchyňa. Tell me how many, I don't know, Patriot devices are located there and there. And I can't get that for you, you know, that's classified information. Well, excuse me, we have evidence here that you've been working with us for a year. And now make up your mind. Either you keep supplying us with information, or you do what we ask you to do, or we just send this to law enforcement and you end up in jail. And they've already got a man recruited and most people have nowhere to turn back. So this has been described in more than one paper about the way agents are recruited nowadays.
And today, there is nowhere to go because they operate in many countries.
So the battlefield where it takes place in our minds requires a very thorough analysis of what is presented, suggested to you, and so on. Just think about it. More people have suffered from the activities of these anti-cult organizations than in the First and Second World Wars combined. And they have directly or indirectly caused death of more people than the sects they sort of condemn. And alternative religions, for example, which they label as sects. So there's something fundamentally wrong here. Yet, take Alatra, for example. We're just ordinary volunteers, people who have our own jobs, people who do this explicitly because we care about the problem that is looming with the climate. Other media outlets are gradually starting to highlight it as well. But basically, we don't do anything else. And look at how our individual participants suffer. And due to the work of such journalists as Tsirokova, Benchatova, for example, where our participant in Ukraine also had journalists come to him, they showed his house, and subsequently, after the war started, missiles flew in and destroyed the house. After all, the volunteer did not live in this house alone, but with his family, children, small grandchildren, and all of them saved themselves only by a miracle. Naturally, after this event, the family had to leave Ukraine, and this volunteer, who suffered 2 contusions in the explosion of his home, was discharged from the army and later peacefully left with his family. He legally crossed the borders of Slovakia because part of the family already lived here. He arrived in Slovakia as a refugee. Here they show his house from all sides. For what purpose? Are we now to expect someone to come and burn his house down? Or someone to come and kidnap him, or something like that? For what purpose? This is where they are sort of getting into the position non-journalistic, and a mistake has slipped in. Somehow we have misinterpreted the information, but literally into the position of endangering the national security of the Slovak Republic and the safety of citizens and people who live in this territory. They are directly involved in marking the targets. So she went there with a clear purpose to show and mark the house. And it was evident in her demeanor when she came here and we asked her about it. She lost her speech and became nervous when we precisely questioned her about it. So she had a clear task to accomplish there.
I mean, basically, reporters in these reports show the object
They show the target.
and thus making the target of the attack.
I also found another piece of information which is very interesting and very important to mention, that FECRIS, in its training of journalists, said that they should infiltrate among the participants of the sect and show their homes, show where they live. So you see, this is exactly the instruction on how you're supposed to function as a guiding agent for something like this to happen.
Unbelievable.
That's shocking. After all, there are plenty of other cases as well where they damage the property of the participants after such news reports. Precisely after these news reports, they spray banners people had up there and things like that. Not to mention, the wave that has been launched against the participants as far as, say, their private lives are concerned. How many were fired from their jobs? How many got trouble at work? You mentioned a case of the doctor in the Czech Republic.
Can you imagine? In the main article of the Seznam Zapravi, a respected doctor was smeared for supporting the Creative Society. Just some photos, I don't know. Somehow they blurred it there. Smeared her reputation, the whole polyclinic. And for what? For what? As you say, we are ordinary people who want to raise awareness of a problem that is a problem of all of us, who can't see that the climate is changing. And for this, we are going to be chased? It doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Another one of our participants, which is very interesting. A participant who has also spoken at conferences. He comes from Bucha, which was bombed. He himself was holding his son, and for several days, they had to hide in shelters. He made a video about it as well, how he and his wife were thinking about who was going to go to the store to buy water because they didn't have anything to drink anymore. And they were saying goodbye because they didn't know if they were actually going to come back from that store at all because it was a few blocks away. And this man actually fled. He's in Slovakia at the moment as well. He's an expert. He was in high position in the field of education and so forth. And here, of course, he wanted to integrate into society. He wanted to find a job. He got kicked out of two. One was a high school, and the other one was also a school. And why did they fire him? Just because he supported creative society. And what's more, they told him he either leaves Alatra or they will have to say goodbye to him.
So in other words, they're firing him for pro-Russian, as they defined it, views. Well, this is a man who suffered and feared for his life in Bucha.
He was under direct bombardment.
Under direct bombardment.
So you can see here, if one looks a little bit closely at this, how there's inconsistencies and often even contradictory information.
And they're just pursuing their goal, and they don't care that the information that they are using to achieve this goal is contradictory, divergent, they contradict each other. It doesn't matter. As long as they put it out there, this is our goal and we want to achieve it.
Exactly. These are not isolated cases. There's also the participant who used to work or still works in a kindergarten, and she had to go on a sick leave because she was threatened with being fired. Because the parents of the children themselves, after seeing the news reports, wrote to the management of the school to themselves, after seeing the news reports, wrote to the management of the school to ask how a cultist was allowed to work in their establishment and educate their children.
That's that presumption of innocence.
So what are these journalists actually doing in society? What kind of sentiments are they stirring up, right? And I may digress a bit, but take the fact that now there was, I think it was young Kaliniak, who almost had a fight with somebody there just because he simply represents a political party. Also, on the other hand, if, say, somebody knows that they voted for somebody, what should they expect now that they're going to get beaten up in the street? What kind of sentiment actually?
Exactly, and in the same
Exactly.
that is to say, these sentiments that, and yet people are completely unaware that these sentiments are deliberately being created to divide us into two camps.
Exactly. And yet politicians themselves from both sides of the political spectrum, the current president, the current prime minister, the next president, they're all calling on people to calm down because they know what the prevailing mood in society is at the moment.
It seems strange to them too, right? You basically have two groups vying to run the state. Nothing more. Each promising the people that they will be better off. And they're not competing with each other as hard as we're being fed in that media.
Creative society, which is only drawing attention to what is happening with the climate. And today, only a blind person can't see what's going on with the climate when you look at what's been happening around the world in the last weeks, months. So an organization that draws attention to that, volunteers who are normally living a standard life, who are patriots to their country, who have families,
Don't break their laws.
who don't break laws, right? They proclaim that we should live in peace. They're subjected to this kind of pillaring. And then, where does it go from there?
The KGB's 200 million seems to have been very well invested in cyber warfare.
Absolutely.
But we can see that it is functional.
Yes, it's really important for people to notice what's going on and try to analytically break it down. Look at the video that came out with Egon Cholakian, which shows exactly the model and the sequence. Feel free to send it to your elected representatives so they too can watch the video and see what is going on there. That way, they will also see the parallel that is happening here and in other countries, because only in this way we can prevent them from succeeding in their aim and in their revenge, which ultimately will not have very good consequences for us.
And we could perhaps also talk about the last stage that is happening now. And that is the persecution that is currently taking place against some participants in the Elytra project. And it is important to understand that all this persecution is only happening because most people are silent. Silence is absolutely the biggest problem we have in society today. In this context, I can also think of a saying. It goes as follows. When they were taking socialists, I was silent because I was not a socialist. When they took the trade unionists, I was also silent because I was not a trade unionist. And when they took the Jews, I also kept quiet because I was not a Jew. And when they took me, there was no one to stand up for me. And that's exactly what we see in society today. All this is happening just because we're silent.
We should not be silent, because this is exactly our responsibility. No one else will defend it. We cannot rely on any authorities to do it on their own. Because look, we have been silent so far, and where we have got to, it is really up to us, up to you, up to Robert, up to me, up to us, the people. Whenever we see democracy being trampled on somewhere, to say so, to put a stop to it. The same thing, the presumption of innocence, when somebody is labeled without any facts.
Without any trial.
Without any trial, yes, exactly. It's up to us to just step in and say no. Not this, it's just not possible. Basically, when the whole nation stands up like that, it's not possible to go through with it.
Exactly. And that is what we're doing now. Just think about it. The government has been democratically elected. The media has been throwing dirt on it in order to destroy it. And what we're doing now is that, thanks to Egon Cholakian, and thanks to this program that we're filming, these practices are being exposed and we're speaking out. We're not being silent. We're speaking out, saying who's doing it, why they're doing it, and so on. The government of the Slovak Republic has my absolute confidence because they're experienced politicians. I really like the fact that they say that they're pro-Slovak, that they're not defending someone else's interests, whether from one side or the other. That said, it would be good if people simply followed example and did not remain silent.
Yes, it is only necessary to stop ourselves because we have got used to the idea that it is normal to throw dirt. It is probably best seen in those politicians. This one does this, that one does that. Some cause is brought up and dirt is thrown. We see it all the time, and we don't stop it either, because we've gotten used to it. We take it to be normal. But But this is not normal. Actually, when we have a state, when we have our representatives, we've elected them, so we go hand in hand with them.
We can ask them to explain some actions that they have done, but basically we are in the same boat with them. It is our country, and therefore we should support them as citizens of the Slovak Republic in this. And of course, demand that they defend the interests of the Slovak Republic.
Indeed.
And therefore, we as citizens of the Slovak Republic can support them. And we must support them, because they are our elected representatives.
Exactly. And it is, as you said, important to restore the understanding of the presumption of innocence. And to speak up when we see in the media that dirt is being thrown, that somebody is accusing somebody of something that, let's say, hasn't been decided by the court of law. It hasn't been. It has no basis, right? It's made of nothing. Speak up. Well, if people speak up and law enforcement stays silent, that means they're in on it too, you know?
Or they are not in their right place.
Or they're not in the right place.
Slovakia was supposed to be a stepping stone in this operation to destroy democracies in other countries and in the United States and the European Union. Let us make it a stepping stone to preserve democracy and to preserve the setup that we have. And let us not allow the KGB to break up this grouping. It is up to us. It is up to nobody else.
Here, we must still realize that there's no hiding now. Now, Egon Cholakian and his group have been working for more than 30 years to uncover this whole, so to speak, Hydra. And today, nobody can make excuses that they didn't know about something. And as Cholakian said in the video, high treason, it has no statute of limitations. This means that all those who were involved will be punished. And this is all the information that we've been trying to bring to you, the people, over the last 10 plus years, for which we have been labeled as cultists, for which you have also been spitting in our faces and in our backs. But we have endured it because we knew what was going on and we needed. We felt it necessary to draw attention to this, because if we had stopped, you would have had a very big problem too.
It's necessary to realize that it is volunteers from all over the world who are gathering this information, which is then put into videos that are then available on our channels. Because there is currently no other summary of what is happening around the planet. No media, no newspaper, no news portal, no television can give you such a complete picture. So basically, if we wrap it up, who's going to do it? Where are you going to get that information from?
Precisely. And all the members, or one could say volunteers, of both the Allatra International Public Movement and the Creative Society are the people who are patriots, who absolutely respect the principles of democracy. Democracy, the word, this word has been used here many times today. But we say it in its true meaning. That is, demos kratos. And that is the rule of people, and not of some elites or organizations. And we fully respect religious freedom. We fully respect freedom of opinion. And it's up to you. You have the information of how it is. And you have the information from the corrupt journalists and draw your own conclusions.
We knew what we were suffering for freedom and democracy. If we threw the Allatra flag down, there would be no one left to raise it. and there would be no one to bring you information.
We would like to thank Egon Cholakian for exposing these KGB practices aimed at breaking up the United States, the European Union, and Russia, and the overall democratic system we have today. Dear Slovaks, please realize that the kind of society we live in is not the fault of one political party or the other, but there are third forces at work here, third forces that are the legislators of the new world order.
And yet we have one far worse enemy, and that is climate change. Let's consider, in just 10 days in April, temperature records were broken in 180 countries. Storms, gales, hailstorms, tornadoes began to appear even in the areas of the planet where such phenomena were rare or never observed at all. On March 31st in China, one strong gust of wind blew out the floor-to-ceiling windows of a multi-story building. The wind gust was so strong that it carried 3 people directly through the broken windows on the 20th and the 11th floors while they slept. Since March 31st, 2 days of torrential rain in western France have caused the worst flooding on record. The storms in China's Jiangxi province were unprecedented. Since March 29th, in arid Saudi Arabia, the rains have not stopped for a week. The spring floods of 2024 in Russia have become a real catastrophe. 39 regions have already been affected. The Orenburg region has never experienced such a flood in the entire history of observations. In Kazakhstan, 12 of the country's 17 regions were affected by floods. This is the biggest flooding in the country in 80 years. The number and strength of earthquakes have increased. One of them is the magnitude 7.2 earthquake that hit Taiwan on April 3rd. This earthquake was the strongest on the island in 25 years. Also untypical for the US state of New Jersey, the magnitude 4.8 earthquake was felt in the major metropolitan areas of New York and Washington, D.C. The quake was one of the largest seismic events on the country's east coast in the past 100 years. In just one day from April 3rd to the 4th, a record number of earthquakes with magnitudes over 5 on the Richter scale were recorded on the planet.
And these are the facts.
And these are the facts. These are facts you can verify. Therefore, we would like to urge all those who follow us to prepare or look at how to prepare for similar climate disasters and changes, because most people die precisely because they do not know what to do, are not informed, and are not prepared for how to behave in a given situation.
You have heard what has happened in the last few days, and the trend is growing. Start taking an interest in what is happening. Get your emergency backpack ready. Count on the fact that if there is even a small probability of an earthquake somewhere, that earthquake will occur there. When an area is prone to flooding, count on the fact that that flood will come there. The point is that we all need to be prepared for what is coming. The point is basically just to know what is happening and to be prepared for it. It's about making sure that we all survive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.